Bloomberg This Weekend, live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini here with Lisa Mateo. It is Sunday, March 8th. A lot of news overnight, especially when it comes to Iran. Let's show you what you need to get caught up on.
Targeting Iran's infrastructure. Explosions send fireballs into the air over Tehran as Israel hits oil sites.
We're not looking to sell. They'd like to sell. We're not looking to sell.
What it means for markets and prices at the pump.
And President Trump says he could possibly put American troops on the ground in Iran.
For very good reason. Have to be very good reason. And I would say if we ever did that, they would be so decimated that they wouldn't be able to fight at the ground level.
New reporting on if that happens, what the mission may be.
And Iran choosing a new supreme leader. One cleric says the so-called Assembly of Experts has made a decisive decision. Welcome to all of you across Bloomberg's many platforms, watching us on Bloomberg Television, listening on Bloomberg Radio, and streaming the show on Bloomberg.com on the Bloomberg Business app. We're here every Saturday and Sunday from 7 o'clock till 10 o'clock Wall Street time, I should say. Markets are closed, but the news does not stop, especially the news out of the Middle East, Christina.
Exactly right. We've got some President Trump sound from him aboard Air Force One we want to start the morning with.
Can you give us an idea of what unconditional surrender looks like to you? I mean, what do you want from Iran?
I said unconditional, not conditional. I said unconditional. It's where they cry uncle, or when they can't fight any longer and there's nobody around to cry uncle. That could happen too, because we've wiped out their leadership numerous times already. So it's if they surrender, or if there is nobody around to surrender, but they're rendered useless in terms of military.
All right, we're going to dig into what exactly that could mean with a panel of reporters and experts as we go through the morning. But first, let's turn to Lisa Mateo for the latest of the headlines. Lisa, what you got?
You got it, and I'll pick it up from where you left off. We have explosions. They were seen on the skyline of Tehran. That was late Saturday. That's after a wave of airstrikes. Israel's military said it targeted several fuel storage complexes used by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It comes as Iran said it had the capacity to sustain the war for months. United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain said they intercepted Iranian attacks overnight into Sunday. The conflict has upended energy markets. The UAE and Kuwait began reducing oil production with the near closure of the crucial Strait of Hormuz. The Trump administration pushed back against worries around the surging energy costs as a result of the war, with U.S. gasoline prices rising to the highest since September 2024. Now, as the Middle East conflict pushes into week two, President Trump says he's ruled out encouraging Kurdish militia to take on the Iranian government. He spoke with reporters aboard Air Force One yesterday.
I don't want the Kurds going in. I don't want to see the Kurds get hurt, get killed. We've had a good relation. They're willing to go in, but I've told them I don't want them to go in.
The president also adding he was ruling out sending in U.S. ground troops unless it was, quote, for a good reason. Now, the comments he made, this was after leaving Dover Air Force Base, where he attended the dignified transfer of 6 U.S. Army Reserve soldiers killed in an Iranian drone in Kuwait. He was joined by Vice President J.D. Vance, other top administration officials. The president later told reporters that it's a, quote, very sad day and that he was glad we paid our respects. Meanwhile, the NYPD mourning the loss of one of its own who they say passed away as a result of a medical episode while deployed to Kuwait in support of Operation Epic Fury. Officer Sorfley Davies of the 79th Precinct, he served in the 42nd Infantry Division in the U.S. Army National Guard. David and Christina.
Lisa, thank you very much. Covering this story here in the U.S. and the Middle East as well. And we have Josh Wingrove joining us now. He's a senior White House reporter for us here at Bloomberg News. He's covering the president's trip to Florida this week. And Golnar Modavalli covers Iran for us here at Bloomberg News. She joins us from London. And Dan Williams is our Jerusalem reporter, joining us once again on this Sunday morning. And Golnar, I want to start with you as I look at the news that broke over the evening here in the United States. We see that the Assembly of Experts has reached a near final consensus, according to Iranian media. And I'm curious if you could just get us up to speed here on where we are in that process after the killing of the supreme leader, that group of 88 clerics coming together to pick the successor to him. Where does that process stand now?
So I think we can say that it's been a delayed process. We've only had this situation of choosing a successor to the supreme leader in Iran once before with Ali Khamenei himself in 1989, and he was chosen the day after his predecessor Ruhollah Khomeini's death was announced. So this is taking much longer than before. And I think obviously it's because the country is under attack, it's engaged in a war, and there are extremely difficult circumstances for the leadership. But as you said, we are hearing from state media that they have reached a decision. The 88 member body, the Assembly of Experts, that's 88 clerics and jurists who are tasked with picking the next supreme leader. They have come to a choice. They just haven't announced who that person is. There have been a couple of statements from a number of members of the assembly, notably very hardline, ultra-conservative members, and people who are well known to the public for being, for having that very hardline, very sort of dogmatic stance on matters of law and the state in Iran. And that, I think, signals that or they are perhaps trying to prepare the public for an announcement that says that Khamenei's son, Mojtaba Khamenei, who has been kind of the de facto front runner for some time, will be named. And if that does happen, that could potentially be escalatory, because we know that Trump has said that he doesn't like the idea of it being him. We've had the Israelis say that they will try and or reportedly say that they will try and also target whoever does come as the next supreme leader. But having Mojtaba Khamenei as supreme leader, if indeed that is the final decision, is a signal that the Iranians are definitely not willing or anywhere close to this unconditional surrender that Trump is demanding of them. And it will also signal a kind of a stronger consolidation between the Islamic Republic and the supreme leader, because Mojtaba Khamenei is widely thought to have strong contacts within the IRGC, particularly its intelligence organization.
Golnar, is that kind of surprising? Because that's usually not how this works. This is not a hereditary position, and usually that's thought of as something that's not done. And do you have any idea on the timing of when this might be officially announced?
So on the timing, we just keep hearing the word soon in state media, in Persian language press, which isn't helpful. We had one report yesterday say that 24 hours, that was yesterday afternoon, but it came from a semi-official news organization that's very close to the IRGC. And I think you have to take these things with a pinch of salt, because there are factions within Iran that seem to be on the surface, or from what we're hearing from people who watch things in Iran very closely and on the inside, that there is a division going on at the top over what should happen. And these factions often use different news agencies, state-run or semi-official news agencies to their advantage. But we did have one come out yesterday and say within 24 hours. And then this morning we've had these clerics come out and say soon we're going to announce it. So on timing, we don't really know much more. In terms of the idea of a dynastic rule, that is problematic for many people. I think when Khomeini, the first supreme leader, took over the country after the Shah was deposed, made it quite clear that he didn't want this to look like a monarchy. He didn't want the supreme leadership to kind of parrot or imitate something like a hereditary rule or a dynastic dictatorship. But I think from about 15 years ago, very gently and very subtly, I think public has been kind of prepared through different kind of messages, through different stories in the media, that the possibility of Khamenei's son at least being in the kind of running for this post has been out there. But one by one, his main rivals have kind of sort of literally died. So it's kind of left him as the only person at this stage.
Right. We heard that even from the president saying, well, the guys we kind of wanted to take over, we took out. So we had to reevaluate. Josh, I want to go to you because you were pool this week. You were traveling with the president. That was a heck of a gaggle on Air Force One yesterday. One of the things that stood out to me is the president not ruling out possibly putting ground troops in this conflict in the region. He said there would have to be a very good reason. Do we know what that reason would be?
we don't. And he also said that, they would do it at a point where Iran's forces were so decimated, it seemed to suggest, the wording was a little unclear, that they might wait until later stages and essentially it would be sort of a mop-up operation, or at least they would hope it would be, rather than more of an active combat operation. I should note also that he sidestepped a question about whether they would go in to take particular oil facilities or what they will do about any enriched uranium and whether it's recoverable. Some reporting from the Times as well to that effect about what will happen to some of the stuff that is literally buried from Operation Midnight Hammer, that attack from last year. So these things are swirling. He kind of sidestepped all of it, and downplayed, I should say, the sort of broader impacts, including on energy markets, including on traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. He really continues to try to frame this as a sort of, quick thing. He called it a short excursion, a minor excursion, an excursion. This seems to be his preferred word, or at least was yesterday, in describing the attack that's ongoing here. So, whether this, how long this goes on remains unclear. That was one of our first questions to him. He really sidestepped it. And we'll see. He just wants to keep everything on the table. One final thing to flag, as you saw in that gaggle, is he downplayed expectations of Iran's current munitions stocks. I think that is sort of like one of the core questions here for the Americans. I suppose for both sides as well. But how many missiles, how many drones are still able to be fired back? At what point will they get there? We just don't know. And finally, you did play that clip about Trump saying, what Cry Uncle looks like. I think that's significant as well, because his press secretary had said something similar. Now he's blessing it. This notion that unconditional surrender can simply be when Trump decides that that's the case, as opposed to needing the words to come out of whomever the leader of Iran is, come out of their mouth.
Dan Williams, as we see these images of Tehran covered with smoke from Israel's targeting of fuel depots in and around the capital of Iran, I want to ask you about Israel's next steps here. And since you and I last spoke, Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed the Israeli people, and he said there's a well-organized plan, that's a quote from him, with many surprises, to undermine the regime, to enable change. We have many more objectives, and I will not list them here. So some circumspection that kind of mirrors what we've heard from American officials as well about the next steps in this conflict. What did we learn from the Prime Minister last night, and what does this new strategy of targeting these fuel depots tell us about where Israel intends to take this war next?
Well, the Prime Minister may not have provided details in that broadcast. The broadcast appears to have been mainly a marker, drawing a line under the first week of this war, telling the Israeli people to prepare for more. It's worth remembering that, unlike in the United States, there is popular support, wide popular support in Israel for this war, but he may be concerned that Israelis are now looking and asking when their kids might be able to go back to school, when their businesses might reopen. There is a bit of a reopening of the Israeli economy, not total. However, Netanyahu's energy minister was on the radio this morning. He did lift the veil somewhat. He said that in the future target set, it may include refineries, it may include power stations. So there is apparently a wider target bank for involving Iran's lifeblood energy sector. However, he said that the emphasis will be on hitting assets that are directly tied to the regime, the IRGC, and so forth. Just to touch on an earlier point when it comes to potential targets of a potential ground landing of forces, I think it's worth watching Hag Island. Famously, that island some 13, 14 miles off the Iranian coast, where some 80 to 90% of its oil has traditionally been pumped to be loaded onto ships. Now that the Iranian Navy has been largely destroyed by the Americans, they would not be able to counteract or fend off, presumably, an attempted landing by the Americans, for example, Marine Expeditionary Force. So given that we're now looking at energy sector targets openly within the target bank of the allies in this war, it's probably worth watching that site as well.
Golnar, you mentioned competing political factions inside Tehran using different media agencies to kind of get these different messages out, something we're not at all familiar with here in the US or the UK. But I do want to ask you about the ultra-conservative group that you mentioned seems to be having more influence than I think certainly people in the White House and in Tel Aviv would have liked, because we have mixed messaging from President Trump about the duration and the scope and the goal of this operation. But there's also some mixed messaging coming from Iran, because you had the Iranian president come out and essentially apologize to Gulf allies for those strikes and say they were going to hit back, say they were going to draw those back. And then on Sunday, he threatened to step up attacks on American targets across the Middle East. That seems to be backtracking from where he was. Can you talk to us about who is winning the messaging battle and who is winning the operational battle and where this is going?
I mean, you're right. There was some backtracking from President Pezeshkian in Tehran today. We obviously don't know exactly what's going on, but I think we can certainly infer that there is possibly in the way that this very heavily decentralized command control structure that they've implemented and brought in since Khamenei's assassination, and also partially after the Israeli and US strikes in June, in real time, when they are in this situation of being under intense bombardment and in war on this scale, it's showing that maybe possibly that structure doesn't always work effectively. And from some people that I've spoken to, people who are former regime insiders, their belief, their idea is that at the top, there's a group that are very heavily aligned with what the IRGC units are doing across the region, and those are the hardliners, and possibly these clerics as well, who have spoken today from the Assembly of Experts, and people like Mojtaba Khamenei. And also we have Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Parliament, who's now also part of this sort of de facto wartime leadership effort that they have going. He's very close to the IRGC because he's actually a former IRGC general and one-time commander who fought in the Iran-Iraq war alongside Mojtaba Khamenei. So we have those guys in one block, and another block we have people that are much more representative of the elected civilian government, which is Pezeshkian to a lesser extent, but also Ali Larijani, who's a very well-known and very highly respected pragmatist, deeply conservative pragmatist politician. But there's a sense that possibly there is a debate going on between these two groups over what to do internally.
All right, Golnar Montavale, thank you so much for joining us. Josh Wingrove and Dan Williams, we will check in with many of you later in the show. Thank you.
We were talking just a moment ago about the attacks on those fuel depots. Obviously, energy is still a major focus of this conflict there in Tehran, but across the region. And we're going to dig into that in just a moment, as we've seen just a massive spike in oil prices over the last week since this conflict began, a spike in gas prices as well. We're going to be joined by Dan Yergin, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author and historian, economic historian. He'll be here on set with us in New York. Talk to him about how he's seeing what's unfolding here in the Middle East and the prospects for higher oil prices in the weeks ahead, warning about this being an unprecedented action here affecting the global energy markets. That's straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend. David Gura, Christina Ruffini, Lisa Mateo, live from our headquarters in New York.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Week, and I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with some of the top stories. And we're starting with this. President Trump is saying that the U.S. was not involved in that strike on a girls' elementary school in Iran. He spoke with reporters aboard Air Force One yesterday.
Based on what I've seen, that was done by Iran.
Is that true, Mr. Nixon? It was Iran who did that?
We're certainly investigating.
Still investigating.
But the only side that targets civilians is Iran.
Now, after Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's statement, Trump fired back saying it was done by Iran. The strike killed more than 165 people. Arab states along the Persian Gulf dealing with a 9th day of incoming missiles, drones from Iran. Bahrain said 3 people were injured after shrapnel from intercepted missiles fell on the country. The strikes continue even after the president said he had instructed the military not to attack any nation that isn't striking them. At the same time, Israeli jets targeted Iranian oil depots. Now, Iran has so far reported more than 1,300 deaths in the war. Meantime, Iran has reportedly chosen a next supreme leader to replace Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Local reports, it points to a council member of the Assembly of Experts who says the supreme leader has been determined. The official announcement expected to come from the Assembly's secretary. And in other news, Polymarket's founder and CEO signaled that the prediction market industry's war-related contracts could become a political liability. Speaking at a sports analytics conference, Shane Copeland, he argued that prediction markets still serve a genuine informational function, but described Iran as, quote, complicated, and said the fog of war breeds misunderstanding. David and Christina, back to you.
Complicated indeed.
Thank you, Lisa.
Tremendous amount of money going into those, for sure.
Yes, exactly right. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini here with David Gura. We are going to talk about energy. Oil prices above $90 a barrel. That's up about 36% in a week. Gas prices, $3.45 a gallon. That is up about 45 cents in a week.
Daniel Yergin, writing in the Financial Times on Friday of this week in an opinion piece titled, "Is the Nightmare Scenario for Global Energy Here?" I'll read a little bit from it. Current oil prices in the 90s are far from the worst case scenario, but right now, the world is looking at the biggest disruption in oil production in history, as well as a resounding shock to global gas markets. The key question for global energy, he writes, is the duration of this explosive war. Dan Yergin, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Prize, The Epic Quest for Oil, Money, and Power, author of the new map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations, joins us now here on set in New York. He's the vice chairman of S&P Global. Dan, great to have you with us on
Thank you
this
so much.
Sunday.
Although we did say in the break, you are dressed a little better than us here on the weekend. It's a lovely tie.
Overdressed.
We'll correct it next time.
Yeah.
I want to start with just a broad question about the gravity of this moment. You get to it in that piece in the FT. How do you look at this in the broad sweep of history, the moment that we're in right now, and the potential for this being a conflict that doesn't last a matter of days or weeks, as the president initially said, but indeed drags on longer than that?
Well, it is, at least it points to the possibility of the nightmare scenario that has really been there for half a century, ever since Iran erupted in revolution and set off an oil shock at the end of the 1970s. So, but this is, at the scale that we're seeing now, there's nothing comparable to it.
And what does that mean? When you say the nightmare scenario, tease that out for us, and what should we be expecting or fearing, I guess?
A nightmare scenario would be a war that goes on a long time, a disruption that goes on a long time, prices really skyrocketing, and 90 is high, but it's not skyrocketing, with major impacts on financial markets, and ultimately the world economy plummeting into a recession. That is more or less this nightmare scenario. That's not where we are, and this would have to go on longer, and also have to see considerable damage of the infrastructure in the region.
Which concerns you more when it comes to possible Iranian outcomes? A more conservative regime that is less likely to collaborate or cooperate with, other world's economic indicators, or a total power vacuum? And can you talk about what the difference would be to the global oil markets and production?
Well, it's hard to imagine a totally chaotic Iran.
Yeah.
Nobody's in control, and there are ethnic divisions in the country that would tie it apart. But I think there is a question of imagining what kind of organization would rule the country other than what it has today, and would it give up? Would it give up its revolutionary zeal, its antagonism to the West, its effort to dominate its region, and go back to being what might be called a normal country? And a country that's focused on economic growth and development and doesn't running short of water as it is right now.
Right.
When you look at the news overnight that the UAE is cutting back production, Kuwait's cutting back production, we see the changes that Saudi Arabia is making, shifting more of its oil through pipelines and not through the Strait of Hormuz. What does that tell you, the way that these countries are reacting to this, about the trajectory of it going forward?
In a way, if you may not remember, during COVID, when all the storage was filled up because the market demand plummeted, people didn't know what to do with oil. And in fact,
you're trading in the negative, right?
Yeah. Oil prices went negative. That's kind of it's not a full analogy, but that's where they are right now. They can't put this. You have a very complicated, integrated system that goes from pumping oil, processing it, getting into tankers, shipping it to markets, and that system isn't working now. It's bottled up, and so that there's no place to put the oil, and you run out of. Basically, the countries are running out of storage, and the only thing to do then is cut back production.
I also want to ask you about that bottled up and the bottleneck in the Strait of Hormuz. We've got some sound from the president we want to play you.
What about the Strait of Hormuz? There's no traffic really going through it.
Well, that's the ship's choices, but we have it cleaned out. We've wiped out their navy. The navy is now at the bottom of the sea, so that's the choice. This is an excursion. We figured oil prices would go up, which they will. They'll also come down. They'll come down very fast, and we will have gotten rid of a major cancer on the face of the earth.
The president has been trying to encourage the shipping to continue, saying the U.S. will help ensure. The U.S. could even escort some armadas of ships as they go through. Is that realistic? And if you were a producer, would you take that risk with your assets?
I think it is a very big risk. Obviously, people still have insurance, but it's now war rates, so it's gone way up. And of course, the administration has said that they will insure ships if they can't get commercial insurance. But the risk is that a lot of the Iranian Navy has been destroyed. but there's still drones, and there's still explosive speedboats that can
Those fast boats, yeah.
that would put a tanker at risk. And so you have to be very bold. And at least as I understand, the escorts, they're not ready to do that yet because naval ships are focused on the war and protecting U.S. battleships. I mean, we did have in 1987, the U.S. provided escorts to Kuwaiti tankers, but there weren't any drones then.
I look back on the last week, and there was that moment when the Treasury Secretary went on a rival network. He was on CNBC, and he floated the possibility of the administration doing more. And investors responded positively to that, as vague as the comment was.
Did he define more?
Did he define more? No. There is a generalized lack of definition, I think, on many fronts here. But that gets to my question, which is, Christina asks about there being kind of escorts, naval escorts, perhaps additional insurance that's backed up or provided by the U.S. government. When you look at kind of the panoply of policy options that could be presented by this administration, what would make the most difference to industry at this point in time?
Yeah, what
There's
would
such
actually
overarching
help?
Uncertainty. What would actually help?
Well, what would be the end of the attacks? I mean, that would be it. It's very simple. And we know that that the air war is aimed at the missile launchers, trying to knock them out one by one. They open up and get them. They're in these missile cities that Iran has. So I think it's trying to get Iran to a position where it simply is toothless. That's the objective. And the president has talked about unconditional surrender. Not sure what that means.
Another lack of definition there as well.
Yeah. And remember, Iran, it's a divided leadership, and as well as a decimated leadership.
We're waiting this morning to see if they have chosen a new leader, but unclear. It won't be the same power center that Khomeini had.
No, he had been at it for a long time.
I'm curious how you see the price, where you see the price going from here. So it's been an incredibly fast move, as you point out in your pieces. We've seen over the course of the week, and we were talking about the prospects of a $100 barrel last weekend. Where do you see the price going from here? And I think there's a question a lot of people have on their minds, which is what is the lag between that happening and we seeing even more manifest at the pump, higher gas prices?
Well, I think that, there are all sorts of predictions out there. You hear people saying, it's over 100 or 150. I mean, I think these are notional ideas that clearly all the pressures are for the price to go up. You have lost 20% of world oil. You've lost 20% of LNG. And as a result of that, markets, you're going to get people bidding for supplies. We see tankers that were going to carry LNG to Europe now being diverted to Asia. So, everything points to higher prices. Where the limit is really depends upon event. And why I say that what's the most important thing is duration. Does this go on a week? Does this go on a month? And that has different consequences.
As you look at this conflict and the economic story part of this, as we talk about it, as we've all talked about it, what are people missing? What is the most important thing that you think people are overlooking in this conflict and how it's impacting the economies?
Well, to me, one thing is that we do have resilience. We're not in the position we would have been a decade or two ago. Because the U.S. is now the world's largest oil producer, that gives a security that we didn't have before. You have production going up elsewhere. You have Canada at 4 million barrels a day. Brazil is 4 million barrels a day, which is 4 times what, by the way, Venezuela is currently producing.
That's interesting.
So there are alternatives, and there are strategic stocks, which were created in the 1970s in response to the threat of a disruption of supply coming from the Gulf. So you have all of those factors at work. You also have an east-west network that can move oil to the Red Sea. So those are things that need to be kept in mind, even as we look at an unprecedented situation.
You bring up those strategic reserves. There's one in the U.S., of course. The president has talked a couple of times about the prospects of drawing that down. What is the calculus the president must use in a moment like this to decide that? So, of course, used by President Biden as the war began in Ukraine. What should the president be thinking about when it comes to whether or not to deploy that oil?
This is a much more serious disruption of oil than the ones that President Biden responded to. We also saw it used at various times on the eve of certain presidential elections when gasoline prices go up. As we know, gasoline prices are the most sensitive prices in the country, particularly sensitive in an election year. So I think that it will be a judgment that you need to send it into the market to reassure the markets. I remember that on the eve of the Gulf War in 1991, they released the strategic reserves, and the price, instead of going up as people thought, went down. So I think I would expect, and it's not only the U.S., but you have all these other IEA countries, and China has built up huge reserves, that those will be used.
I think we want to talk more about China. We want to talk more about Russia. We want to talk more about several things, which is why we're keeping you captive here in our green room, and we will be back with you shortly after we cover a few other things.
Yes, great to have with us here on set Dan Yergin, Vice Chairman of S&P Global, again, the author of The Prize, The Epic Quest for Oil, Money, and Power, of course, that book, the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. Most recently, author of the new map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations.
Yes, thank you for making me feel slightly smarter, Dan. I really appreciate it. All right, so we just heard Dan lay out some of the ways that this conflict could possibly end. But up next, a prominent Middle East expert tells our Mishal Husain about 3 ways he thinks this war could be going. And he also talked to her about some of the very impressive contacts he has in his phone.
We're going to have that excerpt there of Mishal Husain's eponymous show, the Mishal Husain Show, coming up here as we continue to follow the developments out of the Middle East on this Sunday morning. Just to recap what we've learned so far, Iranian media reporting the fact that there has been some agreement among that group of clerics and jurists, 88 in total, having picked a new supreme leader. Our colleague Golnar Motovali just saying a few moments ago, the media is reporting that. We do not have a name yet.
Correct.
We're waiting to see what that is, but obviously, in light of what's happened here and what happened to the predecessor, some effort here to keep that quiet for as long as I think that they can.
Correct. And will that decision be palatable to either Israel or the U.S. and what the consequences will be? We'll be right back.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on some of the top stories. And China's foreign minister is speaking out against U.S. military actions against Iran.
Seeing the Middle East engulfed in flames, I want to say that this is a war that should not have happened. Once again, China calls for an immediate stop to military operations to avoid the spiraling escalation of the situation and prevent the conflict from spilling over and spreading.
Wang Yi was speaking at his annual press briefing on the sidelines of the National People's Congress. In other news, the Pentagon turning to an ex-Uber executive to help in talks with Anthropic and its CEO over how the Defense Department can use its artificial intelligence models. Bloomberg reporting Emil Michael is also trying to build relationships with hundreds of tech companies to speed up the military's adoption of AI. And Team USA continued its winning streak in the World Baseball Classic, beating Great Britain 9-1. Kyle Schwarber of the Philadelphia Phillies, he was the star of the game, hitting a 2-run homer at Dakin Park in Houston, Texas. Team USA takes on Mexico tomorrow. Christina, over to you.
Thanks, Lisa. The U.S. and Israel have, of course, been in close coordination as they continue to make strikes against Iran. But last week, reporting emerged that an unlikely regional ally had also endorsed taking kinetic action against Tehran, Saudi Arabia. Now, the Saudis almost instantly refuted that report. But where exactly does the kingdom stand in this conflict? What is their relationship with the Islamic Republic? And will the regime in Tehran actually fall? We want to welcome our colleague, Mishal Husain, who dug into all these issues with Professor Bernard Hakel of Princeton, who's a regional expert with a surprisingly close relationship with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Mishal, thank you for joining us.
Hello, Christina.
I want to say I feel like I have pretty good contacts in my phone, but listening to your interview, I got WhatsApp envy because this professor apparently regularly texts with MBS in Saudi Arabia.
Yes, Bernard Hakel is based at Princeton, and about 10 years ago, he met Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia and then on a visit to the United States. And because Professor Hakel is a native Arabic speaker, he was born and brought up in Lebanon, they are able to converse in the Crown Prince's native tongue. And they have kept in touch. They do speak regularly via WhatsApp often, and they speak both privately and on the record because Professor Hakel has a book that's going to be coming out later this year about modern-day Saudi Arabia. So that's the context. That's a particular insight he has. But in broad terms, essentially 1 week into this military action, we wanted to explore how quickly other countries in the region were brought in through Iranian retaliation and some of the complexities within those relationships in the region. So between Saudi Arabia and Iran, between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Saudi Arabia and the United States as well. So all of that was part of the tapestry that we explored with Bernard Hakel for this weekend's episode of the show.
I think that's so important because there is an instinct sometimes, especially with Americans, to kind of paint that region as a monolith, but it's really not. It's very different, and there is no love lost between Saudi and Iran. But this report was still surprising, and you asked him about this reporting that the Saudis had endorsed and maybe even encouraged these strikes. We want to play some of that sound.
He did call Trump several times, asking him not to attack. So that's the true version of it. And he, having said that, he also warned the Iranians, because the Iranians did threaten him, that if they are existentially threatened, that they would attack him. And he warned the Iranians that if they were to attack him, he would have to defend himself, and that he would launch attacks against Iran. And I think that's exactly what's likely to happen. You're going to see the Saudi Air Force getting involved in this war on the side of both the U.S. and Israel. He is a nationalist, MBS is a nationalist, and he has to show his own population that he can defend the country against these attacks, because the attacks have been on civilian targets and industrial targets. The major oil refinery has been attacked, and so on. And so he needs to, like the Iranians, reestablish deterrence.
So it sounds like he's saying he's refuting that initial report, but the Saudis may end up getting involved in this conflict anyway.
Yes. So dialing back for a second, it was the Washington Post that reported that over the course of the last month, according to their sources, that Mohammed bin Salman had been urging President Trump to be part of action against Iran. And Bernard Hakel, from his knowledge, is categorical that he does not believe that is the case, that there were conversations between MBS and President Trump in the last month, but that was the Crown Prince urging the US not to do this. So that's how Professor Hakel sees it. I think then the point is that targets within Saudi Arabia have been targeted by Iran in the last few days, as have other countries. And so that leaves Mohammed bin Salman in this position where naturally he needs to not only show his population that he can defend them, but also in a very real way to try and prevent attacks on his territory. Because don't forget, Christina, he's in the midst of this massive transformation of his country. That's what he's trying to do through this big flagship Vision 2030 program. It is why so many American and other companies are trying to make inroads into Saudi Arabia to be part of this transformation and the economic opportunity it represents. So at a very basic level, this kind of situation, missiles and drones flying about, airspace affected, confidence affected, shipping affected, all of that is driving a coach and horses through what he really wants to do with his country.
Right. He's been really trying to appeal to Westerners, including Americans. As you mentioned, we've seen social media has been very interesting during this conflict, and up to this run, you'd see more and more Americans being brought by the Saudi government to see sites and post, Saudi's a great place to visit. And obviously this is complicating that in more ways than one. Before I let you go, President Trump has said he wants a say in who the next supreme leader is. Is that even possible? And based on your conversations, who are the likely candidates?
Well, I think the ideal scenario for the United States would be that not only does the regime collapse, or that it survives in some way that allows a Venezuela-style scenario. This is the possibility that was one of the scenarios Bernard Hakel set out for the future of Iran, that there is essentially someone more compliant in charge in Iran. Now, one of the complicating factors in that is that some of the other people they had in mind, the administration, ended up being killed as part of the strikes. So how thought through that aspect of the plan as well as the plan as a whole for Iran, one has to wonder about it. So what Bernard Hakel does in this interview, and if people listen to the whole thing, they'll hear him set out all of this. He says that there are three scenarios for Iran. One is that the regime survives or indeed is strengthened, and he says that going into it, the regime already had the support of 20% of the Iranian population. Second scenario is some kind of Venezuela-style situation. It survives, but the leadership is very different. And the third scenario, the one that Mohammed bin Salman and many others would be deeply worried about, is that it becomes a failed state, that it descends into civil war, that level of collapse of the country as well as the regime puts incredible amounts of instability and turbulence right in the midst of this already very complex part of the world. So I think we really continue to be at a really perilous time. And Bernard Hakel says that he does not believe this war has been thought through at all.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, but I highly recommend everyone go listen to the full episode. It is out now. Thank you, Mishal, and be sure to subscribe to, what else? The Mishal Husain Show podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere you listen, and watch full episodes on the Bloomberg Business app. David?
Christina, thank you very much. Just echoing what you said there, a really fascinating conversation, which you can download as a podcast, or of course, watch at Bloomberg.com or on the Bloomberg Business app. Well, coming up here in the 9 o'clock hour of Bloomberg this weekend, we're going to sit down with the United States Senator from South Dakota, the junior Senator Mike Rounds, who's going to join us live from Pierre in just a few minutes' time. Plenty to talk with the Senator about. He sits on two very important committees at this particular moment. He's a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee. As we continue to watch developments around the Middle East, we're going to get his perspective on the war in light of comments that the president made yesterday during a very busy day, making his way from Miami, Florida to Delaware for that dignified transfer, back to Miami once again, talking about the prospects for this war continuing, talking about the Navy in Iran being decimated, talking about energy markets as well. Going to get the senator's thoughts on all of that. Of course, also get his thoughts on now former Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, her replacement, Senator Mark Wayne Mullen, due to be confirmed here in the weeks ahead. We'll see what he thinks about that leadership transition coming up as well. But first, it is also International Women's Day here across the world. We're going to speak with two women who are breaking down barriers and have the medals to show for it. Fresh off their victories at the Games in Milan, all while juggling being moms. We're going to bring you that conversation next here across our platforms. You can take us with you no matter where you go. Watch us on Bloomberg Television. You can listen to us on Bloomberg Radio. Stream the show live on the Bloomberg Business app and at Bloomberg.com. Wherever you are, we are there. It is Bloomberg This Weekend. More to come here.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini here with David Gura. It is International Women's Day. And as we were talking around the newsroom about who some of the toughest, coolest women were out there, these two guests are who we thought of. They not only shared a podium, they are both mothers of young children, something that in previous decades would have ruled them out of medal contention.
We're talking, of course, of Kaillie Humphries and Elana Meyers-Taylor of the U.S. women's bobsled team. Let's take a listen.
Elana, I want to start with you. First of all, who do you have there? I want to thank you for being with us and just talk about, this is not your first Olympics, but why it meant so much to be on top of that podium again and to have your family with you.
I have my son here, Noah, and he is very excited. So he's trying to press all my computer keys and everything. But the real reason it was so exciting is because they're my motivation. My kids, both of them, my older son, Noah, my older son, Nico, who's 6, and my younger son, Noah, who's 3. They're my motivation for continuing in the sport. They're both deaf, and I just wanted to show them that regardless of what the world tells you, you can go after your dreams and you could pursue them. And fortunately for me, it ended at a gold medal.
I mean, that's so amazing because for so long, first of all, it was women can have it all. And then it was maybe women can't have it all. And then, but there's this idea that maybe women can have both. And can you talk a little bit about, Kaillie, what the difference is between that? Like maybe we can't have everything, but you can be a mom and be a badass Olympian at the same time.
I think for a lot of years, especially growing up in a very male-dominated sport, you always get told, as soon as you hit 40, it's done. As soon as you become a mom, your body's never going to be the same. And there's all these misconceptions. And a lot of my career, I've had a lot of people, say that I couldn't do things, place a target on my back. It was never going to happen. And so believing in yourself, believing in what's possible, and dreaming big is a huge part that I think Elana and myself have always done. And so to be able to stand on that podium, for me to be able to earn 2 medals at this Olympics, to know that I did it, a year and a half postpartum. There was a lot of doubt, even in my own mind, but I wanted to go out there, put my best foot forward. I had a great team surrounding me, believing in me and what was possible. And, Elana and I were able to get it done and be able to show everybody that because you're a mom, because of, whatever limitations people want to place upon you, if you dream big and work hard, you can make anything happen.
Elana, I want to ask you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is correct. You have the most medals for a Black athlete in the Winter Olympics in history, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
I mean, we could just mic drop at that and leave it there. I would literally tell that to everyone I met, from like the grocery store to the post office. But one of the other moments that I thought was so amazing is, you know, you guys are both in your 40s too. So not only are you moms, but you are on the older end of spectrum for people who are doing the Olympics. And that was a big story this year too, was older athletes coming back and proving they've still got it. What was it like to know, as a mom of 2 kids, as a woman in her 40s, that you were standing there on top of that podium with yet another gold medal around your neck?
I mean, that's the thing. It took me 2 kids and almost 20 years to finally win a gold medal. You know, I've been fortunate to win medals before. So to finally win a gold at this age and having 2 kids when it's improbable, when it's against all odds, was really cool. And it just goes to show you, like, I am a big proponent of the village I've had around me, and I've had a lot of great people, whether it's nannies, whether it's my husband, my kids, for the most part, are behind our dreams.
Listen, we're talking about the realities. I think this is perfect. Yes.
You know, it's just been a journey from start to finish, but I think it's really cool that shows that if you're given the right support system, if you have the right supports, there's no limit to what women can accomplish, regardless of the age, regardless of how many children they have. But I just want to emphasize it does take a village, and it does require a lot of support. I think we need to just do more as a society to make sure women are supported at all stages of life.
Kaillie, let me ask you lastly just about like one part of that village, and that is you guys as teammates, and like what kind of conversation exists about what you all are going through, these big moments in each other's lives, and how you're thinking about that particular part of the village, the team itself, figuring all of this out.
Yeah, Elana and I have been fortunate. We've shared 5 Olympic podiums together. So, you know, most of our career has been on the Olympic podium together. Just like any athlete's journey, you have an individual path. And I think motherhood is no different. You know, my path is different than Elana's path. And, you know, we're similar yet very different in a lot of aspects. But I think for me specifically, and I hope Elana can say the same, you know, we've really pushed each other. I think when it comes to motherhood, you know, she's a little farther ahead than I am. Her kids are a little older, but there were questions. You know, what happens if your kid has to go to the hospital? What happens when you're on tour and this happens? And so I've been able to, and she's been gracious enough to kind of fill me in on what happens, having been in that side before. And then there's, you know, the sport side of things. And I get to be the athlete I am because she motivates and pushes me to be the best because she's working super hard to beat me, and vice versa. There are times, you know, when I win a race by 100th of a second and she's won a race by 100th of a second. And so we push each other to be the best. I know she's out there working every day. And I think that's what makes us so successful on Team USA as a whole, that we can be on the podium for 5 Olympics in a row together because, you know, we've got great support as a whole within USA Bobsled and Team USA, but we really push each other to be the best version. I know she's out there working hard. I'm out there working hard. Neither of us can relax really when it comes to the competition piece. But at the end of the day, we know that we're supported with our team and our team of teams. And that's really what elevates us as a nation compared to the rest of the world.
It takes a village. Sometimes it's an Olympic village. Sometimes
That's
it's
right,
the people we have around you. Thank you both so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
Noah, I don't know if you can see me. Thank you. We appreciate you being with us. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, we're coming up on the 8 a.m. hour here in New York. We're going to speak live with Thomas Nides, the former U.S. ambassador to Israel.
Eager to get his perspective as we see this war continuing to escalate. The next hour, Bloomberg This Weekend, starts right now.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is 8 a.m. here in New York from Bloomberg's Global News headquarters.
I'm David Gura with Christina Ruffini. We're bringing you the latest breaking news, reports, and analysis live this morning and every weekend from 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock Eastern Time. And of course, our focus continues to be on the war in the Middle East. And Christina, we were covering this over the course of the last hour. We understand from Iranian state media there's been a decision on who the next supreme leader is going to be. We don't have a name yet, but that meeting of 88 clerics and jurists has come out with a name. Find out who that is perhaps in the hours ahead.
And interestingly, some of of the candidates who would not normally be in the running are now in the running because those U.S. and Israeli strikes have been so successful at taking out Iranian leaders. They originally took out some of the people that the U.S. had hoped would take that spot. So the question is, does Iran end up with a more or comparably hardline government to what they already have?
Mentioned those strikes, and of course we've seen Israel targeting fuel depots in and around the capital city of Tehran overnight here on the East Coast hours, causing just massive plumes of smoke to cover that capital, as we heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu last night, describing how he intends to prosecute the war going forward.
We are covering the impacts to the markets and to the global economy and to people on the ground. But we're going to start with Lisa Mateo, who has the headlines for us this morning. Lisa.
And I'll pick it up from there. Yeah, new strikes light up the night in Tehran as Israel vows many surprises. Israel's military, they confirmed striking fuel storage facilities in Tehran late Saturday. Now, it comes as Iran said it had the capacity to sustain the war for months. United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain said they intercepted Iranian attacks overnight into Sunday. And the conflict has upended energy markets. The UAE, Kuwait began reducing oil production with the near closure of the crucial Strait of Hormuz. The Trump administration pushed back against worries around surging energy costs as a result of the war, with U.S. gasoline prices rising to the highest since September 2024. Yesterday, President Trump downplayed the need to tap into strategic petroleum reserve.
I filled it up, and he brought it down to the lowest level it's ever been. We will start at the appropriate time, which is basically a gut instinct. We will start filling up these strategic reserves.
Now, the he was referring to was former President Joe Biden. Now, the president made these comments after coming back from a trip. It was to Dover, the Dover Air Force Base. He attended dignified transfer of 6 U.S. Army Reserve soldiers killed by Iranian drone in Kuwait, and he was joined by Vice President J.D. Vance, other top administration officials. The president later told reporters that it's a, quote, very sad day and that he was glad we paid our respects. And here in New York, authorities arrested 6 people connected to unrest during an anti-Muslim protest outside the residence of New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani. It prompted a bomb squad response and a terrorism investigation. New York City Police Commissioner Jessica Tisch said 2 of the people arrested were accused of handling and igniting improvised explosive. Mamdani is New York's first Muslim mayor. David and Christina.
Thank you, Lisa. All right, we're going to get straight to our panel this morning. Joining us now is Christina Kino. She's the managing editor of the Markets Live blog at Bloomberg, and this is your inaugural spot at the desk. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming in. Back with us, we also have Bloomberg's Iran reporter. I'm sorry, we have Golnar Motavali, who's our Iran reporter, but she's joining us out of London. And we also have Nancy Youssef from The Atlantic. Golnar, I apologize. I do want to start with you, though, because you have this great article out where you talk about the repercussions of the choice of the new Ayatollah. And we've been talking about who that possibly could be. And you write, who succeeds as Iran's next supreme leader will have repercussions far beyond Tehran, with the U.S. and Israel closely watching who takes power. While the U.S. has offered shifting explanations for what it aims to achieve with the war it launched against Tehran last week, it has at times signaled a willingness to work with remnants of the administration it is now fighting. Can you tell us not only, we spoke a little bit about who is in the running, but we also want to know what people in Tehran are thinking about where their government is. Is there popular support from one of these candidates over the other? Is there any support for this government? Where does all that stand?
I think broadly speaking, the regime as a whole and the system, the entire system, which includes the supreme leadership, is deeply unpopular with a large section, a large swathe of the population at the moment. I think that's clear from the recent uprising we saw, the fact that these protests have become increasingly frequent and more violent over the past 6 to 10 years. I managed to get through to a few people overnight in Tehran. They are absolutely terrified of what's happening right now. One person I know who isn't too far, living too far from one of the oil depots that was hit by the Israelis, can't leave her house. The sky around her is completely black. It's shrouded in smoke. The Iranian Red Crescent Society has told residents in Tehran not to leave the house because of high levels of toxicity in the atmosphere. We had reports from a CNN reporter who's on the ground right now. He said that there was oil in the rain that was raining on Tehran. Early this morning, there have been photos of, you could see black, remnants of black oil in the puddles from the rainwater. The atmosphere in Tehran right now is one of complete fear and desperation. At the same time, I think there are people, obviously, there are as I said, a large segment of the Iranian population who doesn't want this regime to continue. And I think that's the challenge and that's the dilemma that many they are in. I had a message literally about 5 minutes ago from someone living in Western Tehran saying nobody wants this war, but nobody wants this system and this regime either. And I think that's the dilemma that they are facing right now. And I think it's clear that with the signs all pointing towards Mojtaba Khamenei, that's the son of the slain Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, succeeding, that they're not going to get that. They're not going to get that change that they're looking for at the top. And it also signals that the Iranians are going to double down and continue to fight the US and Israeli joint attack and bombardment on their country.
Nancy Youssef, I want to turn to you and ask you about the way that this war is being fought at this moment in time. You've written quite a bit about that, and we heard from Iranian leadership yesterday a confidence that they can continue fighting this war at this pace for the next 6 months. What can you tell us about the way in which this war is being waged? Obviously, drones are playing a critical component here. Yes, the U.S. has this arsenal of ballistic missiles, huge, expensive weapons, but it is these smaller weapons that are making a big difference on the battlefield thus far.
That's right. So there are 4 initial targets that the United States had laid out in its campaign, going after the Iranian Navy, ballistic missiles, nuclear facilities, and its leadership. But what we've seen in recent days is that and with this latest strike, also damage to infrastructure, hospitals, pharmaceutical plants, police stations, and now oil and energy infrastructure. And I think what you're referring to is sort of the defenses that we've seen from Iran, in which they're launching ballistic missiles and drones primarily in response. The challenge that poses for the United States and for its Gulf partners is they have a limited supply of interceptors that can bring down these missiles and drones. And the cost differential is quite big. Each interceptor costs millions, for in some cases drones that cost $20,000 or $30,000. And so how do you continue to combat them? I think it reflects a war of logistics as much as anything. The Iranians trying to drain the interceptor stockpiles of both the Gulf partners and the United States. The other thing we're seeing from Iran is that it continues to launch drones and can signal to the region that it can keep launching those. And those again pose threats to the region because they can keep launching these attacks even after the United States and Israel target their ballistic missile capability. And so all of that together raises one big question, which is even if the United States is successful militarily, can those targeted strikes translate into the kind of change that they've said they want to see in governance? As your colleague noted, so far we have not seen that. What we've seen instead are fears of either a fractured state, a chaotic state, or remnants of the regime able to survive.
And Christine, it seems almost, I don't want to use this silly, but it seems odd to talk about markets and finance and oil when you're talking about real people's lives and this destruction of combat, but it is important and it is a factor here. And we saw such extremes in the markets this week. Given that volatility and the fact that you heard Secretary Bessent say tariffs are going up to 15%, what are you watching for as we go into the next week?
Yeah, absolutely, Christina. I mean, sometimes markets are kind of the last thing really to be looking at, but it is very much a function of what's happening in Iran, what we're seeing in markets, very directly correlated here. And yeah, I think, this week was really a question of the second order effect of this war, right? We saw the initial reaction from markets last week. That was very much a risk-off sort of reaction. And then markets kind of came back down a little bit from that reaction. But I think in the advent of the surge in oil prices, especially in the back half of the week, in addition to, again, the tariffs potentially coming up again, and of course that jobs report on Friday, which was shockingly just negative. All of these combined paints a picture of an economy that is potentially heading towards stagflation. And that is something that will sound alarm bells for a lot of investors heading into next week.
Well, I want to ask you about just drilling in a bit more on the divide within Iran. We heard from Iranian leadership an entreaty to Gulf allies to say, look, we're not going to strike you unless there are strikes from your countries on us. And that was sort of walked back over the course of yesterday into today. What does that tell you, kind of the amorphousness of that message about divides within the country when it comes to the way that they're prosecuting this war?
I think there are a number of ways of interpreting what happened there. I think we also have to bear in mind that in the background there are probably lots of furious efforts going on to try and find an off-ramp diplomatically to this situation, or at least find some way of de-escalating. And I would have thought that lots of different countries are at the moment getting involved in some way or another to find a decent path towards mediation between Tehran and Washington. And I think one way of interpreting the statement from Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian, where he effectively apologized to the Gulf Arab states and said, we have ordered that these attacks on the region should stop, and we won't attack countries if they don't attack us, or we don't get attacks emanating from US bases in those countries. And that may be a reflection of some of the stuff that's been going on in the background. Conversely, the rhetoric we've been seeing from Donald Trump has not been de-escalatory. In fact, it's been very much the opposite. So one interpretation is that the Trump statements that came out after that statement from Pezeshkian actually then caused the regime and the IRGC in particular to actually push back on Pezeshkian's statement. Yeah. Quite heavily. Another interpretation is that there is a division going on at the top between the civilian elected government and the military units in charge of the operation in the field.
Nancy, you read a really interesting article saying that the U.S. has failed to take the lessons learned in the war in Ukraine and apply them to this latest front. You talked a little bit about drones earlier, but in your article you write, this is a quote from President Zelensky saying, Iranian attack drones are the same as the Shaheeds that have been striking our cities, villages, and our Ukrainian infrastructure throughout this war. But to the surprise of some officials in Kyiv, no one from the U.S. bothered to ask Ukraine to share its expertise in how to defend against drones before starting the offensive in Iran. Now, we did hear that Zelensky spoke with Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi and offered his expertise. Any ovations, indications that the U.S. is listening and is willing to engage on this front? And if not, why not?
It's a great question, because the very drones that Iran is launching were provided to Russia. And so the Ukrainians have more experience than anybody in combating them, and doing so with very limited resources. They also don't have the interceptors that the U.S. and the allies are using, and at least to a much less degree. And so they have come up with their own innovations to combat the drone warfare. While we saw the United States develop an offensive capability in the form of the Lucas drone, which is a sort of American variant of the Shaheed, we didn't see the U.S. developing a defensive strategy, that it was really depending on this multi-layered defense approach, which is very costly. To your question about why not, I think the U.S. has sort of assumed that it was going to be facing threats from countries like China, and not in these sort of close-range fights that it finds itself in Iran, and that if it found itself in that kind of situation, it would use its sort of existing defenses, its interceptors, electronic warfare, among other forms of defense. The challenge is now that they're in this fight, and we don't know how long it's going to be, and draining the U.S. of those defenses is part of the Iranian strategy. I think there are new questions about why they didn't take this step and learn from the Ukrainians and the run-up to this. In some ways, doing so now, it's harder and will have to happen in real time in the middle of the fight. And what we saw, though, is that the U.S. didn't see the need to do this in the run-up to this fight.
Christine, I want to pull back to the conversation that we had with Dan Yergin just a few moments ago. We talked about the oil market, how quickly prices have spiked here over the last week. And I'm curious how you see markets reacting to that broadly. So we're at a moment where, again, energy prices are going up pretty dramatically, yet there still is such roiling concern about private credit, about AI. What role is this playing? Are investors able to see through this still, or is it becoming something that's really clouding their vision of what's likely to happen here in the weeks ahead?
Yeah, I think, what really the war in Iran has done is add to that pile of risks that are already bubbling underneath the surface. I mean, heading into 2026, we ended the year on a high. If you're just looking at the share price of the S&P 500, right? We hit several records last year. We hit a record high not too long ago, actually, in late January. But underneath all of that, there was a lot of concern that this can't possibly last beyond what we've already seen because it's been such a long, fantastic rally. And so now you have all these risks bubbling up, right? You mentioned, David, the questions about AI and its disruption effect. And then, of course, private credit concerns that are now causing people to wonder, is this actually a systemic issue? And then you add war in Iran on top of all of that. And it really is just a situation where people are almost looking for an excuse to pull a little bit back on risk appetite. And I suspect that that's something that we might see a bout of again heading into the beginning of this week.
Golnar, we only have about 30 seconds before we have to go, but I did want to ask you about the Kurdish factor. We heard President Trump on the plane say he has now decided he doesn't want Iranian Kurds to go in, fight back to try to foment revolution in the country. What is your take on that?
So I think when that was floated, that idea, I think we saw a lot of pushback. I think even Iranians who have been pushing for regime change in the diaspora, particularly those who are supporters of the monarchy in exile, were very worried about that. And the reason is because most Iranians don't want to see the kind of balkanization of Iran. And the concern is, I think, that by arming a relatively large ethnic group such as the Kurds, it would put them on a collision course with internal forces and possibly create a civil war and the breakdown of the nation state as a whole.
Well, thank you very much. Golnar Motovali joining us from London. We had Christina Kino here with us on set, and Nancy Youssef, staff writer for the Atlantic Magazine, joining us from Washington. When we come back here, we're going to speak to Tom Nides, the former U.S. ambassador to Israel. He's going to join us live and talk about Israel's tack in this war going forward, the latest developments out of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and the whole Middle East. That's coming up on Bloomberg This Weekend, on Bloomberg Radio, television, and Bloomberg.com.
Thank you for joining us on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with some of our top stories. And President Trump is saying the U.S. was not involved in a strike at a girls' elementary school in Iran. He spoke with reporters aboard Air Force One yesterday.
Based on what I've seen, that was done by Iran.
Is that true, Mr. Hegseth? It was Iran who did that?
We're certainly investigating.
Still investigating?
But the only side that targets civilians is Iran.
After Defense Hegseth's statement, Trump did fire back. He said it was done by Iran, and that strike did kill about 165 people. Now, Arab states, along with many others in the Persian Gulf, they are dealing with a 9th day of incoming missiles and drones from Iran. Bahrain said 3 people were injured after shrapnel from intercepted missiles fell on the country. The strikes continue even after its president said he had instructed the military not to attack any nation that isn't striking them. At the same time, Israeli jets targeted Iranian oil depots. Iran had so far reported more than 1,300 deaths in the war. Now, meanwhile, Iran has reportedly chosen a next supreme leader to replace Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Local news reports they point to a council member of the Assembly of Experts who says, quote, the supreme leader has been determined. The official announcement expected to come from the Assembly's secretary. And in other news, Polymarket's founder, CEO, signaled that the prediction market industry's war-related contracts could become a political liability. He was speaking at a sports analytics conference at Shane Copland. He argued that prediction markets still serve a genuine informational function, but described Iran as, quote, complicated, and said the fog of war breeds misunderstandings. A lot of misunderstandings, David and Christina.
Throughout all of this.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Lisa Mateo there with those headlines. Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke yesterday in Israel. Quote a little bit from what he had to say. He touted a well-organized plan with many surprises and suggested there are many more objectives, which he declined to list during that speech on Saturday. I want to turn now to former Ambassador Tom Nides. He was the U.S. Ambassador to Israel from 2021 to 2023 and joins us on this Sunday morning. Ambassador, thank you very much for the time. And I want to start with a broad question, and that is, as we approach the second week of this war, how clear to you are the strategic objectives for Israel in this conflict?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me this early morning. Thank God I got the clock straight before I got
You and me both.
This was a big concern for everyone, Ambassador. We're very proud of you.
Yeah. Let me listen. You know, one thing I've learned in my career here is foreign policy is very complicated. A lot of things can be true at the same time. There's no question that all of us understand that Iran is a wicked regime. What they have done in the last, multiple decades, but certainly it's proven by what's happened here in the last couple of weeks. Not only have they killed, thousands and thousands of their own people who were protesting, but then they decided, which they've always done, is turn the guns on Israel, which we have known for and done, seen and witnessed for a long period of time. But through their proxies between Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, they made a strategic decision to attack some of their allies in the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE. That totally changed the dynamics here. So one for sure is that this is very complicated, and certainly from my perspective, I'll have no tears lost for the supreme leader. The other issue, I think, is obviously what you've been talking about on the air a lot, is what the end game is. Mm-hmm. And I think, when the prime minister and the president talk about regime change, I've been around this for a long time and was involved in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya. Last time I checked, there isn't Jeffersonian democracies in those countries. So this is really complicated, guys, and we're going to have to all watch this play out in the next couple weeks.
I want to ask you about that relationship between the prime minister and the president, and how much influence Benjamin Netanyahu has over President Trump. We've got a statement from the Iranian foreign minister saying that Netanyahu was duped into conflict. He says they, meaning the American people, have ended up with an administration that Netanyahu, after decades of failed attempts, finally managed to dupe into fighting Israel's war. What's your take on that, and how influential do you think Israel was in convincing Washington to make this decision?
Well, first of all, I don't think I'm going to be suggesting that the Iranian spokesperson actually knows what he's talking about. I think there's a couple of things. First of all, no one, regardless if you love Israel or don't, to believe that what Iran has been doing to Israel through its proxies. Look what they did with Hamas. Look what they did with Hezbollah. Look what they did to their own people. So the idea that somehow people have been duped into realizing that Iran is a bad actor is ridiculous. I think that, when I worked for President Biden, we supported Israel when the Iranians attacked Israel for the first time. I supported them in defense, but also offensively as well. So I don't think anyone's necessarily pushing Donald Trump around. I think that's somewhat absurd. I do think it is important to step back and to understand two things. One is we have to understand what the objectives of this is. How do we determine what success is? I'm not sure success is necessarily, quote, regime change, but one will have to debate that. And I do believe Congress has a role here, guys. I think it's important for us to understand that. And I think will be debated for a long period of time, of the role of Congress as it relates to this particular war.
You bring up Hezbollah, and I want to ask you about Lebanon, because we've seen Israel's attacks now kind of venture into Lebanon more and more. And I'm going to play a little bit of sound here from Israel's Defense Minister, Israel Katz, on what they're doing there in Lebanon. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
And the government of Lebanon will pay a heavy price. If Nasrallah destroyed Lebanon, then Naim Qassem will also ruin it in this way.
Again, Ambassador, we see this kind of renewed focus on Lebanon and Israel claiming there's no sort of territorial claim to Lebanon. What do you make of the way that this war is moving again into that country, not just in Iran, but into Lebanon as well?
I don't know if you've been to Israel, and I'm sure some of you guys certainly viewers who are watching this, Lebanon shares a border with Israel, as you know, and it's right in the northern border. It's a huge risk, and certainly Hezbollah has shown to be a terrible actor. Again, a proxy of the Iranians. And I think, we've seen, it's 8 months ago, a lot of intense fighting to diminish Hezbollah. You have a leader now in Lebanon who the president of the United States has met with. I think ultimately this is going to continue to be a huge area of friction. Israel believes that Hezbollah has not been destroyed. It certainly hasn't been dismantled. They've been weakened, and certainly the state sponsor of their terrorism, which is Iran, has been weakened. But it's a huge threat to Israel. And so, listen, I for one, have been a big advocate of obviously strengthening the president of Lebanon to attempt to try to make these sectarian things come together. But it's hugely problematic for the Israelis, and certainly those Israelis who are living in the northern part of the country.
I want to shift a little bit and ask you, because you were an ambassador, because you were in the State Department, your perspective on the consular part of this. There has been a lot of criticism that the U.S. did not properly warn Americans in the region, its allies in the region, and did not have a plan, even if you needed to keep that as a close hold, not to telegraph the attacks. There didn't seem to be a fast rollout plan to evacuate Americans out of the region. You know, we had that one authorized departure for Tel Aviv, but I didn't see them for other places. And other places around the region, Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, have all been hit really hard. We've got Americans who are trying to get out. The State Department now has organized charters. But what is your response to that initial response from the State Department, and whether they should have done more or better to get folks out faster?
Listen, I can't sit around and second guess. I was the Deputy Secretary of State and I was Ambassador to Israel. I don't think that there's people at the State Department that are reluctantly trying to communicate with people. I think, listen, it's complicated. You're in a military operation happens, it happens quickly. As you know, the rules are very quick. If once the State Department says to the embassy staff that they should depart, they then have to make sure that any American who wants to leave. So it can't be a double.
And that
standard.
notice has to be public for that reason. Yeah.
So I think, listen, they'll be people will step back. I think again, I'm not here to be, trying to be overly critical, because it's really, really complicated. The men and women who work at the State Department, the career people, want to do the right thing. They try to getting charters in is not simple to do, especially when the airspace is complicated. So I think everyone needs to, again, believe me, I have been stuck there when rockets, it's really scary. I mean, the Emirates and the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the Qataris are seeing something that they've probably, in most of these people's lives, have never witnessed. Listen, sadly, I'm talking to my friends every day who are sitting in bunkers 4, 5, 8, 10 times a day in Israel. I don't think it's because they're used to it. They like it. So I think the region is getting a little bit of feeling what Israel has been through for a long, long time, and they don't like it. And obviously, I hopefully those Americans are getting out, because it is scary sitting in a house. I don't think people understand how frightening it is. And especially in places in not in Israel where they don't have bomb shelters, where drones are flying over your head. It really, having been there, it's not pleasant, and you do not get used to it.
I want to draw more on your experience in the State Department. So beyond you just being the ambassador to Israel, but the role that you've played there, as you look at the level of diplomatic engagement with other countries as all of this unfolds. So it does seem like this is very much a mission of the U.S. and Israel at this point in time. And we saw yesterday kind of back and forth between Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, and President Trump. President Trump suggesting that the UK shouldn't join wars after we've already won them. We saw kind of muted statements from European officials here. What should be
Spain.
Yes. Yeah. What should be happening on the diplomatic track at this point in time as the military conflict continues? What do you think the U.S. should be doing, Israel should be doing to sort of get more allies onto its side as this war continues?
As I said at the beginning, foreign policy is quite messy. It's just not, it does not follow a straight line, because things happen and unintentional. A couple of things that are interesting if you step back and look at this. First of all, I think the Iranians' decision to attack Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar was a massive mistake, because, as I say, your enemy of your enemy is your friend. And they certainly have galvanized the rest of the Middle East as it relates to how bad actors the Iranians are. That's number one. Number two, the president's going to need allies, and not only just the Middle East, he's going to need European allies, because if this drags out, obviously there's going to be all sorts of needs for both airspace and supplies and importance of that. And I like to remind people, the European countries are fighting a war against Putin and what's going on in Ukraine. I mean, we've sort of, you guys aren't talking about what's going on in Ukraine. This Ukraine thing is just, sadly, just went to its fourth year. So you have a lot of things going on right now. And, you need, when I was, working at the State Department, you need friends. You need friends in good times, and you certainly need friends in bad times. And so we're going to see ourselves. I'm sure that Secretary Rubio and the Trump guys are reaching out to these allies all the time and trying to get their help. But your point is 100% correct. You need allies in times of peace, and you definitely need allies in times of war.
Ambassador, thank you very much. Really appreciate the time. Hope you won't be a stranger here at 8:33. Just want to make sure everyone knows the time here as daylight saving time begins in earnest. Tom Nides, who is the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, joining us on this Sunday morning. Our thanks to him once again, Christina.
And on a bit more of a serious note,
yes.
If you're looking at your terminal, some headlines crossing. Iran's foreign minister is speaking, giving a press conference. Some of the statements coming out of that, he says, we continue to defend ourselves. Our dignity is not for sale. He also spoke on Trump being involved in selecting the next leader. He says that's nobody's Chinese business. He also said Iran is launching attacks on its neighbors. Says we're attacking U.S. bases and called the war imposed on the U.S. illegal.
Tracking all of this over the course of the morning. Yes, what we're hearing from the Iranians, from the Israelis, from the U.S. As well, paying close attention to see if there's any movement out of Florida where the president is this week. And our colleague Josh Wingrove, who's going to join us in a few minutes once again, traveling with the president in South Florida over the course of this weekend. Coming up here, the price of oil continuing to climb with traffic stopped through the Strait of Hormuz. We're going to speak with an expert about the safety of tankers in that region and about the prospects for those prices continuing to climb even higher. That is coming up next here on Bloomberg This Weekend. Stay with us.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on some of the top stories. And Kristi Noem speaking out. She's saying her new role in the Shield of the Americas, well, it is migration control.
The first objective will be not just on sovereignty, but also migration control, that we will work on economic prosperity. We'll have and reverse these harmful foreign influences that have come into many of our businesses, our technologies, and we've seen infiltrate different areas of our way of life.
Now, Noem is a special envoy for the Shield of Americas. Of course, she was being replaced as Secretary of Homeland Security. Now, she was speaking from a summit luncheon with Latin American leaders on Saturday. And well, the Pentagon, well, that's turning to an ex-Uber executive to help in talks with Anthropic and its CEO over how the Defense Department can use its artificial intelligence models. Bloomberg reporting Emil Michael is trying to build relationships with hundreds of tech companies to speed up the military's adoption of AI. And Team USA continued its winning streak in the World Baseball Classic, beating Great Britain 9-1. Kyle Schwarber of the Philadelphia Phillies, he was the star of the game, hitting a 2-run homer at Dakin Park in Houston, Texas. Team USA, guys, it takes on Mexico tomorrow, so be sure to tune in.
Lisa, all right, thank you very much. Lisa Mateo.
One of the big drivers in this conversation is, of course, what's happening in the markets, in the oil markets, because any conflict in the Middle East, that always impacts prices. So to talk us through what's going on there, what's going on in the Strait, and where we think this is all going, we want to bring in Julian Lee, Bloomberg News oil strategist, and we also have Jakob Larsen. He's BIMCO's Chief Safety and Security Officer. Thank you both for joining us. Jakob, I want to start with you because you have the word safety and security in your title, so I'm hoping you can answer this question. The president spoke this morning about shipping through the region. And obviously, we've heard ovations from the White House saying they could offer possible security escorts, they could offer insurance. But I want to play what the president said this morning about the Strait of Hormuz.
What about the Strait of Hormuz? There's no traffic really going through it.
Well, that's, the ship's choices, but we haven't cleaned out. We've wiped out their Navy. The Navy is now at the bottom of the sea. So that's the choice. This is an excursion. We figured oil prices would go up, which they will. They'll also come down. They'll come down very fast, and we will have gotten rid of a major cancer on the face of the earth.
Okay, the Navy may be down and out, but that doesn't mean there aren't other threats to these large, very slow-moving vessels. What are you hearing from clients, from big shipping companies, when they talk about whether or not they're confident or comfortable sending traffic through this area?
Yeah, what we're hearing right now is that shipping companies in general are not comfortable sending ships through the Straits of Hormuz. We currently have a large number of ships trapped inside the Gulf, and at the same time we have ships outside the Gulf waiting to go in, waiting for conditions to improve. But right now the security threats are simply too serious for shipping to consider going through the Straits of Hormuz, and even also, I think, for U.S. naval escorts to operate safely in the area.
Jakob, we had Dan Yergin on a little bit earlier in the show, and I asked him sort of what could be done from a policy perspective to make things easier, more comfortable for these shippers. And he said it would be for the conflict to end. Barring that, what needs to happen here to give some assurance to those who are operating these vessels that they can go through that strait once again?
I think we need to see the threat from Iran against the shipping industry degraded significantly. And this is a process, I'm sure it's ongoing already. But we need to see that threat diminish before ships will consider to sail through the area again. It might take a while. I don't know exactly how long it will take. I'm sure that our friends at the U.S. Navy, they can tell us more about that. But until we've seen a significant reduction in the threat, I don't think we will see any ships move through, at least not in any significant numbers.
Julian, I also want to ask you, there were headlines this week that producers in Kuwait and Qatar had declared force majeure. Can you explain to us what that means, how it absolves them of some of their legal delivery obligations, and if you think more producers are going to follow suit?
Yeah, I mean, this is a legal clause that essentially says that things outside of the shipper's control or the exporter's control have made it impossible for them to fulfill their contractual obligations, and it therefore allows them to break the terms of those contracts. We're already seeing production coming down. I think we put a headline out just now that Iraq's production is down to somewhere around 1.7, 1.8 million barrels a day. Before the war in Iran, it was about 4.3 million barrels a day. So that's a big cut there. We've also just published a story on Saudi Arabia diverting crude to its Red Sea export terminals and away from the Persian Gulf. And that is all part of this process, but I don't think they can transfer enough to the Red Sea to be able to fully offset what they're not able to export through their Gulf terminals.
Julian, as you highlight our very good reporting from across the region, I'm curious, what kind of conversation is happening or likely happening among OPEC Plus producers? As this kicked off now more than a week ago, there was talk of kind of boosting production as a result of what had happened. How much coordination, conversation, cooperation is happening among these producers now versus how much is this happening unilaterally or just as a result of where these strikes are happening and the kind of daily twists and turns of this war?
I think this is probably very much an individual response to what's happening. There's actually very little that the OPEC Plus group as a whole can do. The spare capacity that they have is largely within Saudi Arabia. And the problem for Saudi Arabia is not pumping oil out of the ground. It's pumping it into tankers that can deliver it to its customers. The problem that it has is that in the Gulf at the moment, there are very few empty tankers. We published a story on Friday saying that was down to 9 very large crude carriers that were likely empty. That number will have gone down since then. As you've said, nothing is moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Taking out the Iranian Navy isn't going to change that. The threat doesn't come from the Navy, it comes from drones and missiles. And unless you can take out the launchers for those, and you can convince ship owners and ship crews that they will be safe, you're not going to get ships going through Hormuz in any great number.
So, Jakob, what are these shipping companies doing? Because, we saw during COVID a storage problem where this product couldn't move. Were they prepared for an event like this, or is this bigger and different than what we saw during COVID?
I think this is bigger and different compared to what we saw during COVID. And honestly, I can't recall sort of any situation for the past decades where we've been in a situation like this before. Right now, the concern on the side of the ship owners is clearly the safety of their crew and the safety of their assets, so the ships. And until the threat changes and is reduced, I agree, we're not going to see any ships move through the Straits of Hormuz in any significant numbers. And how long will that take? Well, difficult to say, but probably it can't be done within a week or so. It'll probably take everything from a couple of weeks to perhaps even more.
Do they have the storage capacity they need in the meantime?
Storage capacity, I'm not an expert in oil storage capacity and the likes, but I mean, given what we just heard, that there aren't a whole lot of empty tankers left in the Gulf, I suspect storage capacity could well become an issue quite soon.
Julian, I'll kick that question over to you, being the expert on oil and storage. Talk a bit about that. I mean, just a few months ago, you and I could have had a conversation about the global glut of oil, and this would have been very far from our imagination.
Well, yes, and this global glut of oil that we've been talking about, I think, is in very large part the reason that oil prices are, around the $90 a barrel level and not the $100 a barrel plus. Mm-hmm. There clearly isn't storage capacity within the Gulf region, and even if there were, that wouldn't be much use to anybody because it's outside that region that you need the oil. The lack of storage capacity there is the reason that producers are cutting back. Beyond that, there is still a fairly significant amount of oil around. I mean, there are strategic stockpiles in the US, in Europe, in China, in other places, and those can and if this goes on for too long will be drawn down. Nobody's taking that step yet because
we're gonna have to leave
the
it there.
world is still relatively well supplied, but it won't be for forever.
Okay, thank you both so much. Julian Lee and Jakob Larsen, we appreciate your time.
Well, coming up, a lot of folks thinking about what happened in 1973 as all of this unfolds, of course, when we had that major energy crisis here in the United States. We're going to take a look back at that history and find out what it might say about our current situation. That's coming up next on Bloomberg This Weekend on Bloomberg Television, radio, at Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini here with David Gura. Oil prices spiked this week following attacks in the Middle East and with Iran effectively stopping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz.
Many countries, including China, rely heavily on energy imports traveling through that critical waterway. This weekend's essay in the Forecast newsletter explores how an oil crisis becomes an everything crisis. It's by Philip Delves Broughton, who joins us now on set here in New York. You write about the echoes of 1973. Not a great economic picture here in the U.S., then all of a sudden war breaks out in the Middle East. And you note that an energy crisis can snowball into a wildly unpredictable everything crisis more quickly than governments can manage. Let's start with just the aptness of the comparison. So here we are in the early days of this war. How good an analog is what we're experiencing now to what happened then?
I think it's pretty good because you've got to start with the domestic political context. That's one place to start. In 73, Nixon was in the middle of Watergate. He had another year or so of his presidency. So the White House was just a terrible place to be. You had inflation was spiking. He tried price controls the year before. But in the economy as a whole, there was an affordability crisis going on. The loaf of bread had doubled. And then you had this oil price spike. Now, it wasn't just the war that started it. The producer countries had been raising prices, as essentially they'd taken back control of oil from the Western majors that had controlled it for many years. So you had this combination of an administration that was really, you couldn't really trust its motives. You had a genuine affordability crisis, inflation spiking, and then this breaks out. And you don't really know how this is going to spin out of control.
So when you look back, I mean, there's a saying, history doesn't repeat, but it does echo. Is this more of a direct repetition? Is it an echo? And are there specific lessons that this administration should be learning from this time in history when there were very similar circumstances?
Well, I think everyone always wants these things to go as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And I think what you're seeing today is exactly that. The Yom Kippur War actually only lasted a couple of weeks before there was a ceasefire brokered by the Soviet Union and the United States. But the effects of it lasted a lot longer, largely because oil prices quadrupled between October and the end of the year. And again, due to the factors I've explained, not just the war, but other sort of macro factors. And I think what you saw then was less developed countries really struggled to pay their bills. Even developed countries like the UK, European countries started having to borrow at enormous rates to just to sustain their economies. And so this thing really dictated the future of the global economy for 2, 3, 4 years, going on through the 70s.
We think of the images from 1973, folks lined up down blocks and around corners waiting to fill up their cars. It was difficult to do, and obviously that had a dramatic effect on sentiment in this country. How do you think about that, the way in which the American public is processing this particular war, this crisis, at a time when the rationale for it hasn't exactly been made clear by the administration?
Well, to go back to the context, I think there is a context of mistrust. You know, what is this administration doing? What are we supposed to believe? Tariffs are supposed to have raised billions, and now here is a war costing billions by the end. A tax cut has been put in place. You have pressure on the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates when inflation is going up. So I think a lot of people are looking around and going, why? What is this? Can we afford it? What's going to happen next? Why isn't there more of a focus on what my household goods basket is costing? Is this a war that's a reckless thing for America to pursue? And a lot of people still remember what happened 20 years ago. That's not out of the public memory. So you have gas lines in the 70s, but also a war that started with prediction that we'd be in and out of Iraq quickly, and that wasn't the case at all.
One of the other things you talk about is the impacts it had on cars and the kinds of cars people were buying. And right, I feel like we keep going through these cycles, and right now, gas has been cheap for a while. Manufacturers are going back away from electric, or big SUVs are on the street again. if this continues to have a knock-on effect, as you mentioned, for several years, do you think we're going to see that reflected in the kind of cars Americans are driving?
Certainly. I mean, in the 70s, the beginning of the 70s, the fashion was these 8-mile-an-hour land yachts, these enormous cars, the Buick Rivera. Big boats with kind of velvet front seats. And air conditioning was going in cars, which vastly increased the cost to run cars. But by the end of the 70s, you had Civics from Honda, you had the Rabbit from Volkswagen. The Japanese and German small cars really started to take off. It took a while, but American tastes really changed by the end of the 70s as people realized there was money to be saved doing this.
Let me ask you last about my favorite part of the essay, and that is the effect this had on popular culture. So yes, we think about how it impacted folks at their kitchen tables, but as you know, it really changed the way folks entertained themselves, the way that sporting events were run. Talk a bit about that, just the effects then and the legacy of that going into this crisis.
Well, there were all kinds of crazy things happened. In early 74, the Daytona 500 became the Daytona 450.
Unbelievable.
Because they only could go 450 miles around the track. The James Bond film, The Man with the Golden Gun, in late 74, was all about this thing called the Solex agitator. It was essentially a device to conserve solar energy, and it was about the rise in the use of solar energy. And Bond thinks the sheikhs will try and buy it, the oil sheikhs will buy it to raise the price of oil. You had truckers who had protested the oil price rises become these kind of modern cowboys. And so in the 70s, you get films like Every Which Way But Loose, Clint Eastwood with an orangutan in a truck. But the trucker had become this kind of modern cultural figure, which you can actually
so
apply
problematic.
to the
Do you see that happening? I mean, do you expect to see this creep into Hollywood, pop culture, all of the above?
I don't think you can avoid it over time. If this goes on, oil crises just are they affect everything in our lives. They not only affect geopolitics, but they affect the way we live. As you said, we've been dialing back on electric vehicles in what now seems like a terrible moment to have been doing that. And eventually, you'll see it in music, you'll see it in films. This will become a moment that people remember, like they remember the 70s.
Philip, thank you so much.
In a moment of wakelessness, I thought about watching that Clint Eastwood movie with the orangutan, but I have not done that yet.
I Googled it and almost bought it online, and then I decided to put it in the queue. It's in the queue.
A deep cut. That and the Daytona 450, another detail I really love from
Which I did not know existed and was fascinated by.
There you go. You can read more about this story, get a jump start on your weekend with the Forecast newsletter. You can subscribe at Bloomberg.com/weekend.
And we are approaching our 9 a.m. hour here in New York. Coming up, we're going to speak live with Republican Senator Mike Rounds from South Dakota. He serves on the Senate Armed Services and Intelligence Committees. That interview just ahead in the next hour of What Else? Bloomberg This Weekend.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We're coming to you live from Bloomberg's global headquarters in New York. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Lisa Mateo. It is Sunday, March 8th. Lots happening overseas. Let's get you the latest from what's going on with Iran.
Targeting Iran's infrastructure. Explosions send fireballs into the air over Tehran as Israel hits oil sites.
We're not looking to settle. They'd like to settle. We're not looking to settle.
What it means for markets and prices at the pump.
And President Trump says he could possibly put American troops on the ground in Iran.
For very good reason. Have to be very good reason. And I would say if we ever did that, they would be so decimated that they wouldn't be able to fight at the ground level.
New reporting on if that happens, what the mission may be.
And Iran choosing a new supreme leader. One cleric says the so-called Assembly of Experts has made a decisive decision.
All right, a lot to get to this morning. Obviously, we've been tracking these reports coming out of Iranian media that a new leader, Ayatollah, has been chosen. We don't have a name yet. We don't have specifics, but those reports coming out, and we will bring you more information on that as soon as we have it.
But from the Iranian foreign minister as well this morning, talking about the state of play in that conflict, and just something we're keeping track on over the course of the morning here, what Israel's saying about next steps and how Iran is saying it's going to reply.
And Iran clearly not backing down, either rhetorically or kinetically. We want to catch you up on everything that's been going on this last hour. Lisa Mateo, please let us know what's been going on.
You got it. We have explosions seen over Tehran's skyline, and this is after more strikes. This is coming from Israel's military. It said it targeted several fuel storage complexes used by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And some of the latest headlines coming on the Bloomberg terminal, the UAE air defenses are responding to incoming missile drone threats from Iran. The defense ministry said in a post on X, as residents in Dubai reported hearing several blasts. And in Norway, the explosion at the U.S. Embassy in Oslo earlier today, well, it's being investigated for links to the Middle East conflict, among other theories. That's according to police there. Well, the conflict has upended energy markets. We have the UAE and Kuwait. They began reducing oil production, and that's with the near closure of the crucial Strait of Hormuz. The Trump administration, they pushed back against worries around surging energy costs as a result of the war, with U.S. gas prices rising to the highest in September of 2024. Now, as the Middle East conflict it pushes into week 2, President Trump says he's ruled out encouraging Kurdish militia to take on the Iranian government. He spoke with reporters aboard Air Force One yesterday.
I don't want the Kurds going in. I don't want to see the Kurds get hurt, get killed. We've had a good relation. They're willing to go in, but I've told them I don't want them to go in.
And the president adding that he is not ruling out sending in U.S. ground troops if it was for a, quote, very good reason. Now, he also made those comments, and that was after leaving Dover Air Force Base. That's where he attended the dignified transfer of 6 U.S. Army Reserve soldiers killed by an Iranian drone in Kuwait. He was joined by Vice President J.D. Vance and other top administrative officials, and that he said he was glad we paid our respects. Meanwhile, the NYPD mourning the loss of one of its own who they say passed away as a result of medical episode while being deployed in Kuwait in support of Operation Epic Fury. Officer Sorfli Davies, he's of the 79th Precinct. He served in the 42nd Infantry Division in the U.S. Army National Guard. David and Christina.
Thank you, Lisa. And also during that Q&A session above Air Force One, the president was asked about U.S. oil reserves and skyrocketing prices.
A lot of oil. We've got a lot of oil. Our country has a tremendous amount, and there's a lot of oil out there. That'll get healed very quickly.
Would you consider using the SPR or tapping into the SPR at some point?
Strategic Reserve?
Yeah.
Well, I'm the one that built them up. We will start at the appropriate time, which is basically a gut instinct. We will start filling up the Strategic Reserve.
The appropriate time based on the gut instinct of the president. Back with us now is Bloomberg senior White House and Washington correspondent Josh Wingrove.
Did you hear Josh there? I could hear it. That was Josh's question.
I was just about to ask Josh, was that your question? I know that.
A recognizable baritone.
All right, so tell us why you wanted the president to answer that and what you thought of his response.
Well, 9 days ago, the president was on the road in Corpus Christi talking about gas prices. This before or right on the eve of the attack on Iran. This has been the way he has deflected concerns in this midterm cycle around prices generally. Gas has been one of the things he can point to and says, it's the prices have come down. Now, of course, it's been shooting in the opposite direction since this attack in Iran. So the question is, where does it go from here? And the U.S. took one step kind of under the radar and sort of slipped it out in the evening a few days ago. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent allowing for 1 month sort of stranded Russian oil that's currently at sea can now be sold to Indian refiners. The administration calling on, if not begging, India publicly to take as much of that as they can and start refining it. Trump telling us on the plane yesterday that he's open to doing other similar moves like that. In other words, easing sanctions that are already in place to try to get more oil moving. But this is just a sign of how they're grappling with the fallout from this. He said they did expect gas prices to go up. You can imagine if you're a frontline Republican in this cycle, your big question is how long does this last and how long until those prices come down? So much of this, for those of us that covered the prior administration, feels a little familiar, right? Grappling with the impacts of prices and, just sitting there praying that they come down as people start going to the polls. And so that's where we're at on this one. The SPR question, though, was kind of a funny one because, he didn't really answer it, but he seems to be viewing it from the sense of when they're going to fill it, not from when they're going to draw it down. So I think the core takeaway from that is that he hasn't been talking a lot lately about that as an option.
Josh Wingrove, thank you so much. Excellent palm trees going on behind you.
Josh Wingrove, our colleague there, covers the White House for Bloomberg News. I want to turn now to the junior senator from the state of South Dakota. That is Mike Rounds, who sits on the Senate Armed Services and the Senate Intelligence Committees. And let me just start with Iran, if I could, on this Sunday morning, Senator. Thank you very much for being here. We have heard so many different rationales for the U.S. pursuing this war with Iran. And I'm curious, if a constituent were to approach you and ask why we're doing this, what would your response be 9 days into this war?
Well, thanks for the opportunity. And we've actually had constituents. I'm right back in Pierce, South Dakota this morning. And, yesterday at coffee, one of the coffee clutches that we try to stop in and say hello at. One of our constituents asked exactly that. What's going on, and was this the right time to make this move? And my message was, I don't know that there's ever a right time, but in some cases, as you start to gather your intelligence and you see what your adversaries are doing, they have a say in it as well. In this particular case, we knew that while the nuclear facilities had been really significantly disrupted, that Iran was still looking at other things, including going back in and getting the nuclear supplies, the uranium that has already been developed. That doesn't go away. It's simply buried. The second piece on it, and probably the more important pieces right now, is that they had continued to increase their supplies of short-term and intermediate ballistic missiles and a huge number of drones. And they were building them very rapidly. And the question was, is as long as their air defenses had already been taken down significantly during the 12-day war, was this the appropriate time to actually go back in and take out those other items? But there's one more piece in the middle of it. There had been diplomatic talks going on, but in the background, we know what their purposes are. I mean, we've got very good intel, and we know that even though they were publicly talking about diplomacy, behind the scenes, this was simply to delay. And they had no intentions of making a deal with regard to their nuclear activities in the future. They were not going to give up the opportunity to make a bomb. So, number one, at what point is there a good time to have a conflict? There's never a good time, but there are better times than others. And the longer we waited, the more of their offensive capabilities that would inflict lots of damage on our bases in the Middle East and on our allies, while at the same time we weren't building our defensive capabilities as fast as they were building their defensive capabilities. It takes time for us to take some of our more complicated missile systems and to develop them.
Senator,
so
just to interrupt, do you have a good sense of...
The opportunity was there, but we needed to do something.
Do you have a good sense from the administration about what they're thinking when it comes to timeline? Because just as there's been varying rationales for this, there's also been kind of mixed messages about how long this administration is preparing to be engaged in this war.
I don't think any of us are expecting an extended long-term engagement. But remember, we're now just, 8 days into this conflict. And so far, our plans appear to be going as scheduled with regard to taking out their defensive capabilities. And now we're working on the offensive capabilities using some of our additional equipment that are less or that are perhaps not as capable. In other words, we can use F-22s, we can use F-35s, and in doing so, it's really tough for them to find us and to shoot us down with those types of equipment, and with our missile systems that we can use to basically go in and take out their communications and their defensive capabilities. When that happens, now we can take some of our other heavier equipment, our B-1s, our B-52s, and so forth, and they can come in and really do strategic strikes throughout the country to take out more of their capabilities, which includes their ability to actually make the drones and so forth.
Senator, I want to ask you about what you're just talking about, these coffee meetings, talking to your constituents. And the president was asked on Air Force One in that same gaggle we keep playing if he was concerned about gas prices, and he said he wasn't. So I'm wondering, when you talk to your constituents, when you talk to Americans who are really feeling economic pressure, are they worried about it, and are you worried about it for them?
Well, I think when this started, we knew that there would be a spike because it does impact an area of the world where 20% of the fuel or the oil that's developed is moving through the Strait of Hormuz every day. And so you've got to be concerned about it. But did we know that the prices would go up? Yes. The question is was there ever going to be a better time in which to take on this operation? And was there any chance that we would ever be in a position to where it wouldn't have to be taken care of? And
so you support
honestly,
the president taking this action?
The best time to do it.
Sorry, I spoke over you. So you support the president taking this action at this time?
Oh, definitely. No question. Look, the president had to make a tough decision. This is the right call at the right time. And we know that prices are going to go up for a period of time. But once we've secured the Strait of Hormuz again, and once that oil starts to move through once again, then prices will begin to stabilize. And at some point in the future, as there's clear evidence that we've taken out their ability to attack that shipping, then the price will start to not only stabilize, but it will start to come back down. We're 8 days into this. We knew this was going to be tough, but we also know that it's the right thing to do, right time. The Iranian regime that's in power today has no intentions of giving up their offensive capabilities, and they clearly were working at becoming more of a threat to their neighbors in the Middle East and clearly a threat to U.S. interests.
Senator, let me ask you about your appetite for potentially a long war, potentially an expensive war. So we have not heard the president say definitively there will be no boots on the ground ever in Iran. I'm curious your reaction to that. And then also you're back in South Dakota today, but what do you expect the conversation is going to be like among your colleagues on the Senate Armed Services Committee about the prospects of an emergency defense spending package as a result of this?
Yeah, first of all, the president is correct when he does not commit to never doing something. In other words, you never take away options. That then gives your adversaries the opportunity to take advantage of that. So you never take away an option, and the president is correct in that with regard to that. It doesn't mean he's going to send troops in, but he never takes away the option. That's important. Second piece on this, yeah, look, we know that these are expensive. The question is if we can get in now and get this done in a fairly short period of time, it would be less expensive now than if we would have delayed it and allowed the Iranians to continue to develop their offensive capabilities in that region. So right time, never a right time, but this is a better time than if we would have waited another month, 2 months, 3 months, and then had to have gone in and found even more offensive capabilities that we would have had to have addressed.
But with the president refusing to rule out the possibility of troops on the ground and, going to Dover this weekend to greet those U.S. casualties, already casualties coming back from the war, when you look at the America First agenda, you have to be getting at least some inkling of concern from constituents, from supporters of the president, how this is helping them and their families if we're looking at U.S. casualties and higher prices in the U.S.
Yeah, look, number one, like I say, nobody ever wants to go into a war, but sometimes the responsibility of the president is to defend the United States, and that requires judgment about what the right time it is to bring troops in. We never want to see our young men and women get into a fair fight. We always want them to have the advantage.
But is this worth it? What is the president trying to do here, and is it worth American lives?
It's not a matter of being worth it. It's a matter of at what point do you take out a major threat to the United States and to the stability throughout the Middle East. And right now is the right time to take on the Iranians and to take out their capabilities before they develop them even more. And so, look, I was governor here in South Dakota for 8 years. During the time in which we were sending young men and women off to war, I went to 31 funerals. There is no leader out there that wants to go to funerals, but there is an obligation to recognize the threat of the loss of life for these young men and women. And there is no such thing as a young man or a woman that dies in battle where you don't affect young families. By definition, they're young, they're warriors. This is not taken on lightly. It's a matter of judgment and whether or not this is the right time long term to protect U.S. interests. I think the president made the right decision, knowing full well that it was a very serious decision, and the threat of the loss of life for young men and women was there.
Senator,
but that's the reason why you have a president that looks at the big picture and at what the right thing is to do for our country long term.
Senator, you've talked a lot about our efficacy in striking sites within Iran, military sites in Iran. There is some concern and controversy surrounding a bombing of an elementary school, a girls' elementary school in Iran on the first day of the war. Let's take a listen to what the president had to say to a reporter on the plane yesterday about that.
Based on what I've seen, that was done by Iran.
Is that true, Mr. Nixon? It was Iran who did that?
We're certainly investigating.
Still investigating.
But the only side that targets civilians is Iran.
And that assessment that this was done by Iran runs counter to what news organizations, including the New York Times, have put together looking at all of the visual evidence. I'm curious sort of how you see this proceeding from your vantage on the Armed Services Committee. Do you anticipate hearings? Are you confident in that investigation that's going to take place by the Pentagon here in the minute we have left?
Yeah, number one, nobody in the United States targets civilians. We just simply, we don't do that, and particularly children. Iran does.
So do you think it was an accident?
They're a terrorist organization. Don't know for sure what happened right now. Excuse me. What we do know is that we do a better job of actually laying out what actually does happen once we complete an investigation. We don't know whether that was sitting right next to a very sensitive military site, whether or not the Iranians built something right next to a school with the intent of trying to protect that military site. So let us do the investigation. Let us lay this thing out. The one thing that you do know is that in the United States, we will do a good job of looking at it, but most importantly, we do our best with our strategic weapon systems, with our very capable smart weapon systems, to avoid doing damage. But when you have this type of a conflict, unfortunately, there are times in which civilians are hit. We don't like it. We don't want it.
Thank you, Senator.
But sometimes it happens, very unfortunately.
Senator, thank you very much. That's Senator Mike Brown's joining us from South Dakota on this Sunday morning. Coming up here, our political panel is going to join us here on set in New York to talk about this story and others. That's coming up on Bloomberg This Weekend on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with the top stories. And President Trump, he is denying that the U.S. was involved in the strike of a girls' elementary school in Iran. He spoke with reporters aboard Air Force One yesterday.
Based on what I've seen, that was done by Iran.
Is that true, Mr. Nixon? It was Iran who did that?
We're certainly investigating.
Still investigating.
But the only side that targets civilians is Iran.
And that strike killed more than 165 people. Meanwhile, the war in Iran rages on. Israeli jets targeted Iranian oil depots late Saturday. And some more headlines coming across the terminal. The IDF said the Home Front Command search and rescue forces, together with emergency teams, they're currently operating at impact sites in central Israel after a missile attack. And a hospital in Tel Aviv says one badly injured person has been brought in from an impact site in Tel Aviv. All this happening while Iran reportedly has chosen a next supreme leader to replace Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Local reports, they point to a council member of the Assembly of Experts who says the supreme leader has been determined. Now, that official announcement is expected to come from the Assembly's secretary. And in other news, Polymarket's founder CEO signaled that the prediction market industry's war-related contracts could become a political liability. He was speaking at a sports analytics conference. Shane Copland, he argued that prediction markets still serve a genuine informational function, but described Iran as, quote, complicated. David and Christina will say
Lisa, thank you. Yeah, I predict we're going to have a good panel here in just a moment. Before we get there, the president traveling quite a bit yesterday. He was in Florida, then Delaware, then back in Florida. And on the course of that trip, he got up, walked around the airplane.
Whenever the president is going to or from a moving vehicle or airplane, there's usually a chance to get him to talk.
It looked kind of turbulent there, but he stood for about 20 minutes fielding questions from reporters. Really ran the gamut, talked about Iran, oil, allies, and the length of this conflict. Let's take a listen to some of what he had to say.
I think we've accomplished more in 1 week than anyone thought possible. We've wiped out their Navy, 44 ships. We've wiped out their Air Force, every plane. We've wiped out most of their missiles. You see, the missiles aren't coming much anymore. We've also hit their manufacturing areas where they make the missiles very hard. Their drone capacity is way down. And we've hurt them where it hurts. Including about every form of leadership you can have, we've wiped out.
You still expect up to 6 weeks total?
I don't know. I never reject that, whatever it takes. But the military is almost non-existent, if you look. We could hit the military itself very hard, but maybe we will, maybe we won't. We haven't made that determination.
What do you think about gas prices? Gas prices right now? Are you worried about gas prices right now?
No. This is a short excursion into something that should have been done for 47 years. 47 years it's taken to do this, and no president had the guts to do it.
What are the circumstances where you'd send in ground troops? How are you thinking about that?
I don't even want to talk about it now. I mean, that's. I don't think it's an appropriate question. You know, I'm not going to answer it. Could there be? Possibly, for very good reason. Have to be very good reason. And I would say if we ever did that, they would be so decimated that they wouldn't be able to fight at the ground level.
Are you thinking about the oil facility there? There's an oil facility kind of on the coast of Iran that could be secured by ground troops. There's been some speculation that could be a target.
I don't know what the speculation is, but I certainly wouldn't be able to tell you that. I'd be in trouble with myself if I told you that.
Mr. President, don't you need ground troops to secure the enriched uranium at the nuclear sites?
We're going to find out about that. We haven't talked about it, but it was a total obliteration. They haven't been able to get to it. And at some point, maybe we will. You know, that would be a great thing, but right now we're just decimating them. But we haven't gone after it, but you know, something we could do later on. We wouldn't do it now. Maybe we'd do it later.
You said you want to be involved in the selection of the next leader of Iran. Can you talk to me?
Well, because I don't want to just come back every 10 years, and mostly you'll have presidents, that won't do that because they don't get it. But we don't want to come back every 5 years or every 10 years and do this. So we want to pick a president that's not going to be leading their country into a war.
All right, here with us now on set are two Trump experts, if that's a moniker I'm allowed to give out.
Or they want, I don't know.
Or if it's wanted, we can debate that off camera. We've got Puck News Washington correspondent Abby Livingston and Bloomberg's Opinion senior executive editor Tim O'Brien, who literally wrote the book on the president, Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald. And on that note, Tim, I'm going to start with you. What is the president doing here? Why is he doing it now? And does he care about the midterms?
Let's see. Definitely he cares about the midterms, but before we get to the midterms, I think Trump always has goals, but he doesn't always have a strategy, and it's important to separate the two. And generally the goals revolve around wanting to appear he can act unilaterally at will whenever he feels the need. And there's a large amount of performance art associated with it. And in small venues, that's okay. If it's a reality TV show or it's a real estate deal, it has less impact on the world. Obviously, it's become more consequential now that he's president. And I think he sees Iran as a flex. And I think he primarily went into it as a flex, and that's problematic. Times is on the administration's side to an extent right now. It's a short-term war. Trump keeps referring...
Hopefully, possibly.
Well, that's the issue, right?
Yeah.
Because he keeps referring to oil prices will come back down. And we have enough missiles to see this through. But all that is predicated on the idea that it is a short, quick strike, and he comes out of it showing that when he feels that his allies, in this case Israel, or the White House's own interests are threatened, he will take action quickly and unilaterally and on very short notice. That's going to get much harder to defend and to answer to as time goes on. Because if oil prices stay elevated, businesses are affected by that and consumers are affected by that. If missile supplies dwindle, it limits our actions in Ukraine or against China. And so all this stuff is going to start to weigh more heavily.
Abby, you looked like you wanted to add to that.
Absolutely. When he acts unilaterally, this means that no one else shares the blame. So if you go back to the Iraq War and the Bush administration had Congress vote on this, so Senator Hillary Clinton, Senator John Kerry owned some of the blame of the political fallout of this. And as someone who's obsessed about the midterms, I don't think he has that much time. Republicans are already freaking out on the Hill based on what happened in Texas this week, where more Democrats turned out. And so this gets more complicated and tenuous for him based on the price of oil and if there are more American casualties.
He used the word excursion, Tim. We've heard that a couple of times now over the course of these last 8 or 9 days, and I'm curious how you see that reverberating around the halls of Congress, indeed across the country, as a lot of these lawmakers are up for re-election. When does an excursion become something more intractable?
Yeah, it's not a good word. You know, it is not a round on the golf course. Yeah. That's an excursion. This is a military attack with enormous consequences. And I think he takes it more seriously than just an excursion. I don't think he understands the implications of it beyond being an excursion. I think he sees it as something he can go in and get out of. But if the goal actually is to reduce Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium, that's still beneath the ground in Isfahan, which we bombed last year. But in order to get it out and make sure that it doesn't remain available to the Iranians, we're going to have to commit ground troops. And the second,
that's not a remote action. You can't have a drone do
no,
that.
You can't have a drone, or even, we used heavy-duty bombers to try to take it out, and maybe completed 90% of that job. Yeah. But according to intelligence reports, it's still available. It's about 970 pounds. It's about 60% enriched. It would have to get to 90 for the Iranians to be able to use it in a nuclear weapon, but it's there. And so once Trump commits troops, all bets are off. This is the thing he criticized about both the Bush and the Obama administrations, that we got committed to long land wars with no end game.
Abby, since you are obsessed with the midterms, I'm going to give you a little room to run here.
Okay.
All right. So before the midterms, there is a Kentucky primary in May. And we've just heard that President Trump is going to be heading to Thomas Massey's home district on Wednesday to stump for his primary challenger. Massey, one of the rare Republican critics of the president, has also been involved with a Democratic colleague, Ro Khanna of California, trying to bring forward those Epstein files. What are Massey's chances, given his position? And then what are some other races before we get to the midterms that we need to keep an eye on?
I think Massey's political standing is to be determined. They've come after him before, and he's come out in flying colors. But the problem is that they're just going to unload the fuselage of advertising against him. But on the issues he is in contention with the president are issues that are popular with the base, most specifically the release of the Epstein files. I think going forward over the spring, there aren't that many Republican primaries because Donald Trump is able to endorse and clear the field. But I think that the Texas primary runoff between John Cornyn and a state attorney general, Ken Paxton, is the World War III of the GOP civil war that's been going on for the last 15 years. And whether John Cornyn can secure that endorsement, which it appears he's about to, and is that enough for him? And so every Trump endorsement is not just about getting the endorsement, but what do you do with it?
Tim, I want to ask you some other news that happened this week. That Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, relieved of that position by the president. Curious, A, how surprised you were by that. This hasn't been a cabinet that's gone under many undulations here over the first year of the president's second term. And second of all, what does it say to you, if anything, about the way directionally that department changes if Senator Markwayne Mullin of Oklahoma were to be confirmed?
Well, I think they've learned a lesson in terms of how much patience the American public has with Americans getting shot and killed on the streets of American cities. It's a shame that it had to go to that place before policy changed. I think in Noem's case, it's another reminder of what irks Trump. He stayed with her during a number of other marketing stunts. He stayed behind her during all of the problems associated with the deportations. What tripped the wire here was that she shifted blame for a $270 million ad campaign that appeared to also benefit Corey Lewandowski onto the president.
An aide of hers.
An aide of hers, or more possibly based on
Yeah.
her testimony before Congress. We don't know, but she didn't deny any of that either during her testimony, which complicates it further, makes it more embarrassing, potentially, the administration. But the line she crosses, she didn't take a hit for Trump. She essentially threw Trump under the bus in a public forum. And that is basically a death warrant in the Trump administration. You've seen it time and again with people, and I think that's what happened here.
And Abby, quickly before we have to go to break, does taking Markwayne Mullin out of his seat compromise Republicans at all, or is that a pretty safe district?
It's a pretty safe district. I find it hard to see that end up being competitive.
All right, but it just doesn't seem like there was a lot of strategy there. They're just confident enough that it's a red
literally got
district.
the call, like a minute before?
Yeah,
he
you seem to
faced
find out
cameras and had to
shortly
deal with
after
it.
reporters.
Yeah, and I mean, Oklahoma is as red as it gets, so I will be shocked if that becomes a competitive seat.
All right, hold that note. Abby, Tim, stay with us. We're going to drill down into the impact of White House policies in Iran when it comes to oil and the markets.
And just to get everybody up to speed on sort of what we've been tracking over the course of this morning, out of Iran, there has been local news, state news reporting the fact that there's been a new supreme leader elected or selected by a group of 88 clerics and jurists. No name for that individual yet, but certainly a development here that we're continuing to track closely. Our reporters around the world watching all of that unfold. That name being held in close secrecy as a result of what happened to that person's predecessor here over the last few days. And certainly tracking what the president's doing as well. As we heard from Josh Wingrove, our colleague in Florida, the president remaining there over the course of this weekend. Yes, he was in Delaware for that dignified transfer yesterday. Had this summit of Latin American leaders there as well, but of course paying attention to see if he says anything else, Christina, about what's to come here in this war.
That's right. We've also seen Iran's foreign minister speaking out and pressing back against the United States, saying that they are going to continue attacking U.S. bases and that Iran apologized for the inconvenience, but that the war imposed on Iran is illegal. Stick with us. We'll have a lot more on markets and munitions when we come back from the break.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg this weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with some of the top stories. And China's foreign minister is speaking out, saying that the U.S. military actions against Iran are not working.
Seeing the Middle East engulfed in flames, I want to say that this is a war that should not have happened. Once again, China calls for an immediate stop to military operations to avoid the spiraling escalation of the situation and prevent the conflict from spilling over and spreading.
That was Wang Yi. He was speaking at his annual briefing on the sidelines of the National People's Congress. Well, moving on to the Pentagon right now. And then it's turning to an ex-Uber executive to help in talks with Anthropic and its CEO over how the Defense Department can use its artificial intelligence models. Now, Bloomberg is reporting Emil Michael is also trying to build relationships with hundreds of tech companies to speed up the military's adoption of AI. And Team USA, yes, they continue their winning streak in the World Baseball Classic, beating Great Britain 9-1. Kyle Schwarber, he's of the Philadelphia Phillies. He was a star of the game, hitting a 2-run homer at Dakin Park in Houston, Texas. Team USA takes on Mexico tomorrow. David and Christina, you know who also got a hit in that game? I'm a Yankees
Aaron
fan.
Judge.
Yes, Aaron Judge. Yes,
Lisa's
RBI single, 6th inning. Thank you, Judgy.
Lisa, you're always a hit with me.
Thank you.
Oh, groan.
Come on. All right. I got a groan in my ear from the control room. You know it's
Groans
bad when they're
around.
actively pressing a key to
Yes.
groan at my lame joke. All right, look, earlier we spoke with Dan Yergin. He is the vice chairman of S&P Global and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. We talked to him about the current oil reserves and the U.S. markets. We want to play you some of that sound.
You may not remember during COVID when all the storage was filled up because the market demand plummeted. People didn't know what to do with oil. And in fact,
You're trading in the negative, right?
Yeah. Oil prices went negative. That's kind of it's not a full analogy, but that's where they are right now. They can't put this. You have a very complicated, integrated system that goes from pumping oil, processing it, getting into tankers, shipping it to markets, and that system isn't working now. It's bottled up, and so that there's no place to put the oil, and you run out of. Basically, the countries are running out of storage, and the only thing to do then is cut back production.
Dan Yergin from earlier this morning. Here back at the table with us, Tim O'Brien of Bloomberg Opinion, Abby Livingston of Puck, and joining us now, Christina Kino, our managing editor for the Markets Live blog. Christine, let me start with you and picking up off of that. We're going to talk a bit about how this is influencing the conversation about affordability in the context of politics. But pick up on what Dan was saying there. The moment that we're in, the worry that exists in the market right now about how quickly oil prices have risen, the way that that's translated to gas prices here in this country, and what investors are expecting here in the days and weeks ahead.
Just all those things. If you can unpack all of those things.
In a nutshell.
Where are we
in
going,
30 seconds.
Christine?
No.
No.
Take 45.
I mean, honestly, I think markets are waking up to the impact of all of this, right? I mean, we have seen gasoline futures ticking higher earlier this week. Granted, they're nowhere near the peaks that we've seen in prior years, particularly in 2022 when inflation got really bad. And so that tells you that there is a lot of room left for markets to price this in. And so the longer that the war goes on, the higher the oil prices go, there's that much more room for markets to wake up to the reality that this isn't necessarily going away. And the impact of higher oil prices, a lot of policymakers like to dismiss that as transitory. We've heard that initially from Federal Reserve speakers over the past week. But the point at which it becomes not transitory anymore and more longer term is really when it starts to hit consumption. And that's really what we're going to be watching out for, especially when, as we've seen again from the jobs data on Friday, the labor market is at a very fragile state.
Abby, I want to ask you, don't worry, I'm not going to ask you those questions because those would panic me. But we heard the president this morning was asked about gas prices. And he said, the reporter said, are you worried about gas prices? And he said, no. And then went on to talk about there's lots of oil and gas everywhere. And, we're doing really well with it. And there's lots of gas. Should he be worried about oil prices? Are constituents going to be worried about oil prices? And are Republicans trying to keep their seats going to be worried about all of the prices going into November?
I think so. The most important number right now in the midterms is the generic ballot, which is how much of an advantage Democrats have over Republicans on just a Democrat versus Republican matchup. Gas prices could outpace that in relevance when the election's over affordability. And then you also have the issue where Americans are going to be looking at the billions spent on this war and wondering why it's not being spent on Americans back home. I think right now it's he does have time, but once we get into the summer driving season, this is going to be absolutely baked in, and we will probably see newscasts in front of gas stations and the prices right behind them almost every single night.
I have done those live shots.
There you go.
They are terrible and very difficult, and my heart goes out to anyone being assigned that this summer.
Tim, let me pick up on this and just the messaging hurdle that the president faces. He ran for re-election talking a lot about affordability and his efforts to bring prices down. We all heard the State of the Union, which he, yes, fabricated some numbers about gas prices, but the general thrust of what he was saying was gas prices were down. Now they are charging upward. He is acknowledging that somewhat on an airplane with reporters, but not publicly. He hasn't given a formal speech to the nation about the motivations for this war. At what point does that become something that the American people demand? A clear, crystalline rationale for why this is happening and the result that's going to happen here economically?
Well, you know, I think when Trump says he's not worried about gasoline prices, I think he's telling the truth, because I think he's panicked about gasoline prices. And he knows full well that it's likely that Joe Biden lost the 24 election in 2022 when inflation started to spike. And the impact that had on voters and voter sentiment was extreme. And it's always interesting, too, that neither party seems to me to learn that those bread and butter issues are always the thing that drives the vote at the ballot box. And right now, voters are contending with soaring electricity rates, food costs, inaccessible health care, and now you're adding gasoline to the fire. And it's only going to get worse the longer this war goes on. And I think Trump is going to get called to account more readily, more aggressively, and possibly more permanently, because his window for staunching the bleeding is really closing. And they've been doing these sort of Hail Mary passes around policy positions meant to offer some relief to consumers, but none of it's sticky. It's very stuntish, and it's not bringing down the prices that consumers care the most about. And now you have job losses starting to escalate. All of this is a really toxic brew for any president going into a midterm, when you're already in a position to be disadvantaged, as most presidents are going into a midterm. So the question then is, how does that redound on J.D. Vance or whoever might succeed Trump in 2028?
Christine, we talk a lot about how the markets are not necessarily the economy, and the CPI is not necessarily the markets. And all these things, especially right now, have been a little bit disconnected. If I hear the phrase K-shaped economy one more time this week, I heard E-shaped economy. I don't even know what that means. But when we look at things going badly, it seems like all of a sudden these things are syncing up when you're seeing a big global shakeup event like this. Talk to us about what that means, and then how do the jobs numbers factor into all of this?
Yeah, absolutely, Christina. I mean, yeah, I think, you know, the notion that the market is not the economy probably holds less and less water these days, because a lot of the wealth of households is tied up in equity markets, right? And so more and more it is becoming the economy in this sense. And so, you know, again...
Sorry, we have to stop you. Your mic is not working. I can hand you mine, but we won't make Abby talk about the CPI. But I do want to ask, I mean, talk about that. Is that messaging effective? Because the White House keeps saying the economy is strong, but if American consumers aren't feeling it, does it matter?
You can say that over and over again, but consumers feel the pain. And also, this war did not start off popular. Most of the public does not support this war. So you're not going to have to go through that moment of transition where a voter has said, oh, that Iran war was a great deal. I'm okay with the gas prices, and then slowly becoming less satisfied with that. So I think this is a very dangerous political spot.
Tim, you want to get in on that?
Well, you know, the markets in this economy matter to retail investors and the small fry more than they did in prior markets. And you saw last year when Trump jacked up tariffs and the markets collapsed, retail investors came back in and filled the gap. That so far hasn't happened over the last week. That may be true this week, but the reality is it is a barometer for both smart money sentiment and average people now. And so to say it's not the economy is true in the short term, it's never true in the long term.
Tim, thank you very much. Tim O'Brien joining us here on set. He's Senior Executive Editor for Bloomberg Opinion here at Bloomberg. Abby Livingston of Puck News joining us here on set in New York as well. Christina Kino, next time.
Christina, we're going to come you back, and next time I'm just going to come stand next to you.
I promise that will happen, or I'll have one that I can hand to you. I apologize for that.
We don't want to miss your brilliance again.
Here, at Bloomberg News as we talk about the developments in politics over the course of this week, which of course dovetails so closely with all the foreign affairs reporting that we've had over the course of the morning, yesterday and today with the situation in the Middle East, Christina.
Exactly right. And it, like we talked about earlier, it can seem odd to talk about finances at a time like this, but they are all related. Look, we live in the world of real politics. This is the driver for some of these forces. These are how these leaders are making decisions, and there are a lot of decisions to be made as this conflict continues, at least for the foreseeable, hopefully short-term future.
Yes, and an ominous warning from Dan Yergin, of course, a little earlier today about where those oil prices are going. Well, after this, we're going to play the game Pointed, created by our colleagues here at Bloomberg News. That's coming up on Bloomberg This Weekend, on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, and at Bloomberg.com. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is time for Pointed, the news quiz for risk takers.
We've narrowed down our categories to things we should probably know from the news of the week. But before we test our knowledge, I'm going to throw it over to our game master, Lisa Mateo. Please don't embarrass me live on television.
Oh, this is my favorite part of the show, guys.
Explain how it works. We should do that first. How does Pointed work?
And so you at home, you could play too. Go to Bloomberg.com/Pointed. There's 10 questions there. I'm giving you guys 3 and a little bonus question. But basically, here's how it works. So if you take a look, if you're listening on radio, we have 30 chips in front of each of them.
Chips.
So Christina has 30 poker chips. David has 30 poker chips, okay? And so if you get the question right, you keep your chips.
Okay.
If you don't, you bring them to
Mama
Mateo,
okay,
and I take them from you,
Yes.
all right? So that's how it works.
And this is for just pride and honor,
It's
whoever
just
wins.
for pride and honor. Yes, bragging rights go a long way here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
We
so
know that. What are the categories?
The categories. Okay, let's start with markets.
Okay.
That's your first category. Caribbean is your second category, and inflation is your last category. So taking that in mind.
Based on my understanding
Yes.
of those 3 things, how would I allocate my chips?
How are you doing that?
I'm going to put 20 on markets.
Ooh.
I'm going to put none on the Caribbean and then
Okay.
10 on inflation. Christina, how about you?
I'm feeling not overly confident about any of these
Equally
categories.
not confident.
So I'm going to do 10,
Okay.
10, and 10.
Oh, you're splitting it even.
I'm splitting it up.
All right.
Let's see what happens.
Hedging her bets, as it were.
Ooh, okay. Are you ready for your first
Yes,
question?
in the
Okay,
category
this
of markets.
is markets
All right.
category. Okay, what key South Korean stock index dropped nearly 20% before rebounding this week? South
I don't know if I'm going to spell it correctly.
You know, we'll see how much Bloomberg Radio Christina has been listening to since she
I'm
started
learning,
here at the
guys.
company.
I'm learning. I talked to you about
And
the
what
Nikkei, but that's
hours
not
of the
this
day
one.
No, I'll give you a hint.
No.
It is not the Nikkei.
It is not.
Thank you, David
That's all
Gura.
right. Yeah.
Are you ready?
I'm ready. Are you
Okay.
ready?
Yeah.
Flip your panels,
1,
David.
2, 3.
You start. What did you say?
The Kospi.
Oh,
I got it
Christina
right.
said it too.
I almost flipped the P and the S. I was
I'll
so.
lead Crow, but I'll
we
keep
get
my
to-
20 chips.
we get
Thank
to
you
keep
so
these
much.
chips,
David,
right?
you have 20.
I have 20.
Christina has 10.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, 'cause
we're
he outbet
moving
me.
on.
All
I'll
right.
bet you
Yes.
big time on
We're
that
going by
one.
points here.
My
Caribbean.
hubris. Caribbean.
Are you ready for Caribbean?
I am.
All right.
Okay.
I'm bet nothing on it, so I'm very ready for it.
Prime Minister Kamala Persad-Bissessar. She is a vocal supporter of the U.S. capture of Nicolas Maduro. Leads what country?
Great
what
question.
country does
Oh, I
she
like how
lead?
David looks right at me.
You know, I bet nothing
But
on
you
this. I will
remember-
say yesterday,
Yesterday,
we were
President Trump
watching
was
the proceedings
listening to it.
unfolding
It's
at
one of the
Doral,
ones
and
with
this
an
was
and
like
in
a
it. I
2-minute
just-
long disquisition.
Yes.
I know the answer to
I
this
think it's
one,
this
but I
one.
don't get anything from it.
President Trump loved her name yesterday. He was
Sorry,
talking
I'm
about it
gonna
at the Shield
erase
of
it.
America
Hold on,
Summit
hold
for a
on.
very long time.
Okay, hold on.
If it's the other one that sounds similar, I'm very embarrassed.
Yeah,
Okay,
okay,
come
hold
on.
on. Again,
I
this is
love
for
the
all of the
music.
no chips that I've put down. Okay.
I'm looking. Okay.
Yeah?
Ready?
Should we reveal?
All right. Flip
3,
it. Reveal.
2,
Christina,
1.
you reveal yours. You have Trinidad and Tobago.
look
Trinidad
at
and
that.
Tobago. You
Wow, look at
both
that.
got
Let's
it.
see.
I couldn't remember if it was Turks and
come on.
Caicos or
Yeah.
Trinidad and
All right.
Tobago.
You
Okay.
gotta
But
be
now we're
kidding me.
tied.
So now you're
I
tied
caught
because you
up.
bet 0.
Oh, good.
Yes. So now Christina has 20 and David has 20. Okay. This
Final-
is your
what's the
third
final
question.
category?
Inflation.
Inflation.
Okay, you
All right.
ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
like this is a Gura
Inflation
category,
around
but okay.
Europe grew in February, driven in large part by which country?
Oh my gosh.
Inflation
In Europe?
around Europe grew in February, in large part by which
All right.
country? In February.
February.
What
The
happened
month it
in
was.
February?
As we sit here in March.
Okay.
This is the last question?
Think about it.
Is there
this
a
is the
bonus?
last. There might be a
There might
bonus
be.
if we
All
need
right,
a
depending on-
tiebreaker
yeah,
here. I gotta
could be
know.
a
I don't
tie.
know.
All right.
Is it like? Okay, go. Let's just answer.
All right.
But think about it. February. It was a great month.
February is a great
Something
month.
big happened,
What
in,
happened in
February.
We did a lot of things on
Europe.
it in this show,
Yeah.
so I'm hoping I've gotten it right. But
Okay. All right, flip it, guys. David, Germany, Christina, Italy. Italy is the answer.
Olympics.
The Olympics, guys.
because I remember
Oh my
people
gosh.
complaining about because Italy is usually one of the not least, but less expensive places.
So
in
wait,
Europe.
you bet
All right,
10,
there you
so
go, Lisa.
hand those
Mama
over to me.
Mateo,
Can I
she
have
said-
them?
No, she gets
nope,
them.
nope, I get them.
Take my chips.
So, okay, so you're down now,
I'm
David.
down, but
Okay,
that's
so
it.
you have 20.
Do you wanna
and
do the
have
bonus?
Okay, let's do a bonus.
Okay, all right. Let's give him a chance to win his money back.
Let's do bonus.
In the final minute we have.
This is a tech one, okay?
Okay.
Let's go.
That's the category.
Apple announced a new $599 budget laptop called the MacBook what?
No.
Come on, techies, let's go.
Okay. I think
The
I remember
MacBook
seeing this. Our
what?
Mark Gurman,
Yeah.
noted Apple reporter, covered this.
Under
but-
$600.
Yeah, which is like somewhat affordable. All right.
We'll see. Okay,
That's a
flip
good
it.
one.
The MacBook Petite.
I think it was like Neom or
Neo. Oh, you can give him that. That's close. I'm not giving him anything.
No. Brutal times here on
Because
Pointed.
it's competing with the Chromebook.
Yes, that's right. Which are very cheap. I see them in my kids' classrooms.
But it looks like we are going to have a tie because you have 20 and you have 20.
Well, no, she's got 30.
I have 30. Oh, I missed the other one.
I have 30, so I am the victor. I will say
he is a victor.
David has beat me quite a lot in practice, so this is a rare moment of victory for me over the very
It doesn't matter when I win in practice. It matters when it happens in real life.
For all the marbles.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa.
But I do want to mention, if you're playing online, you do have options. It is a multiple choice. You guys didn't have the multiple choice, so it was a little harder. It was a little harder for you.
And there are 10 questions,
and
it's a lot of fun, and you can find it where? At Bloomberg.com.
You can go to Bloomberg.com/pointed. You got to play the Pointed quiz.
Yes.
It's every week.
There's also Alpha Dots. A lot of new games coming our way here on Bloomberg, and this is addictive. Alpha Dots is pretty addictive as well.
And look, if you haven't checked out the Weekend print product,
it
is absolutely incredible.
Pocket.
I'm new here.
No.
I was aware of it, but wasn't an avid reader of it. Now I'm an avid reader of it. It is really interesting. It's a lot of like thoughtful and just kind of cool stories that appeal to a smart audience and also me. And I really enjoy them.
The winner of this week's Pointed, Christina Ruffini.
Thank you for joining us on Bloomberg This Weekend. Join our colleagues in Asia this evening when global markets kick off trading at 7 p.m. Eastern. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura, along with Lisa Mateo. We will be back with you next Saturday, 7 o'clock Eastern Time. For our audience on Bloomberg Television, the Mishal Husain Show starts right now. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. See you next week.